Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Thursday, January 26th, 2017 meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council. Call this meeting to order. The first matter before us is a pleasure to welcome a new council member. We'll do so by providing the oath of office for Supervisor Skip Thompson. You can just remove that. This is the oath for the office of council member, Delta Stewardship Council. I, Skip Thompson.
I, Skip Thompson.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend.
That I will support and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
And the Constitution of the State of California.
And the Constitution of the State of California.
Against all enemies.
Against all enemies.
Foreign and domestic.
Foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith.
That I will bear true faith.
And allegiance.
And allegiance.
To the Constitution of the United States.
To the Constitution of the United States.
And the Constitution of California.
And the Constitution of California.
That I take this obligation freely.
That I take this obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation.
Without any mental reservation.
Or purpose of evasion.
Or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties upon which I am about to enter.
The duties upon which I am about to enter.
Skip, welcome aboard.
Thank you very much.
I think, we've got to stage this.
Okay, we got to stage it.
Properly situated. Okay. Welcome aboard.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, great, thanks. Skip, would you like to say anything?
A politician that doesn't want to say anything. No, I just wanted to thank Randy and the council for the warm welcome I've received and the briefings that I've been given. So I look forward to hopefully a productive year or 2 years that I'll be sitting as a member of the council. So thank you all.
Thank you. Susan Tatayan, our vice chair, is ill today and will not be here. And council member Damrell is expected to arrive about 10 o'clock. So we'll begin with our roll call.
Johnston here. Weinberg here.
Fiorina here.
Thompson here.
Okay, we have a quorum, and our next item is file item 4. We will recess to closed executive session. For those of you that are following on the webcast, I expect we will be reconvening about 9:40, so check back then. We are now recessed for executive session. All right, Bob, I think we're about ready to go. Welcome back. We'll re-enter open session. There was no action taken in closed session. That concludes file item number 5. File item number 6, adoption of the December 15th, 2016 meeting summary. So I have a move adoption. Weinberg, Johnston, any discussion? The
Mr. I'll be abstaining.
Councilmember Thompson will be abstaining. We'll begin with the vote. Fiorina, aye. 4 in favor, 1 abstention. The motion passes. Thank you very much. On to file item number 7, the chair's report. For those of you that weren't here when we convened at 9 o'clock, Vice Chair Susan Tatayan is ill and will not be here. And in December, Mayor Asia Brown offered her resignation. A lot of responsibilities as mayor of the city of Compton have led up to this decision. So we have a vacancy that is a Assembly Speaker's appointment. We have been in touch with the Assembly Speaker's office, and we would anticipate an appointment soon, knowing the level of work that we have to do here. Once again, I want to welcome Supervisor Skip Thompson. He was administered the oath of office earlier and is officially representing the Delta Protection Commission as a member on the Delta Stewardship Council. So Skip, welcome again. At the end of last year, we received word that Department of Water Resources Director Mark Cowan had announced his retirement. Subsequent to that, I've had the opportunity to meet with the interim director of the Department of Water Resources, Bill Croyle. Bill is someone known well to all of us from the early days of the Stewardship Council when he was involved in emergency preparedness, and then most recently heading up the Drought Task Force. Bill has established a good record of success, and we look forward to working with he and the department on the many matters that we have in common. Councilmember Johnston and I attended the Levy Investment Strategy workshops in Stockton and in Walnut Grove a week ago and this past week, and you'll hear more about that from staff. At the August joint meeting that we held with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, we agreed to appoint 2 members from our agency and their agency to meet in coordinating efforts around the levy investment strategy. That 2x2 group, as we refer to it, has met 3 times, and we'll anticipate another meeting with that group prior to our February council meeting. At the most recent meeting of the 2x2, it was determined that it would be well to have a couple of members from the Department of Water Resources, so the 2x2 has become a 2x3. And that probably will begin sometime early in February. Yes?
Who are the 2 members that are in that subcommittee?
Joe Countryman and Mike Valines represent the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. Myself and Susan Tatayan, our vice chair, represent the Stewardship Council. And it's uncertain who will represent the Department of Water Resources. Some housekeeping items related to our schedule today. I'm hoping that we can work through to the end of the agenda. I anticipate that will result in a ending around 1 to 1:30. I'll make a game time decision. If it looks like you all are getting hungry and we need to break for lunch, I'll make that decision later. There are 3 comment letters that we received recently in the back related to our levy investment strategy, water transfers, and peer-reviewed science report. And lastly, is there anyone here who parked around this building? Show of hands. Anyone? All right. You'll need to see Pat. She has a parking pass. You'll get towed away if you don't have a parking pass in your window. So Pat is located at the table over here. That concludes my report. Anything anyone else would like to share? All right. On now to file item number 8, Executive Officer's Report. Jessica
Okay.
Pearson.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, after 5 years of drought, any amount of snow and rainfall would probably seem like a lot, but this year it really is a lot. It's been an exceptionally soaking month. San Francisco is experiencing the 7th wettest January on record to date, and some parts of the state are approaching rainfall totaling 200% of normal for the rain season that began October 1st. Since October 1st, downtown LA has received more than 13 inches of rain, 216% of normal for this period. The Sierra snowpack will be measured again next week, but already sensors are telling us that the snow water content is between 158% of normal for this time of year in the northern Sierra and 238% of normal for the southern Sierra. Reservoir levels, too, have come back up. Shasta, the state's largest reservoir, is at 124% of its historic average for this time of year, and Oroville, the major reservoir for the State Water Project, is at 126% of its historic average. Of course, wet years also bring flooding, which we've seen across the state, and some delta levees have suffered breaches, particularly in South Sacramento County near the Cosumnes and McCollum rivers, and in Sassoon Marsh, and many of us are saying thank goodness for weirs and bypasses in the last few weeks. So right now I want to take a moment and play what we found to be an informative 2-minute video that's been put together by the Department of Water Resources that kind of gives you a visual on what's occurred over the past month. Bob?
January 2017 is off to a very wet start. We experienced heavy rain and snow from a series of storms, which resulted in major snow accumulations in the Sierra, record rainfall in some parts of the valley, large inflows of water into California reservoirs, as well as flooding in areas across the state. Levee breaks on the Cosumnes and McCollum rivers resulted in areas of flooding in southern Sacramento County. A number of streets and houses were flooded, as well as a number of vehicles lost due to the high water. As a result of very high tides and the high flows in the Sacramento River, there was pressure on some islands in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, as well as the Sassoon Marsh. There was overtopping on Van Sickle Island, as well as in the Grizzly Island area. Water can be seen flowing directly over the top of levees. DWR conducted flood fights to protect levees during overtopping. Folsom Lake experienced high inflow due to the heavy precipitation. As a result of this high inflow, a large amount of water was released through the flood control gates. This flow totaled 60,000 cubic feet per second. With this much water being released from Folsom and Nimbus dams, the American River Parkway experienced flooding. Areas along the river were closed to the public due to the high water event, including Discovery Park. The flood system in Northern California has been very active, with system weirs flowing into the overflow and bypasses. On Tuesday, January 10th, DWR opened the Sacramento Weir for the first time since 2006, allowing the water to flow out of the Sacramento River just north of downtown Sacramento and into the bypass system. 35 of the 48 gates were opened on the Sacramento Weir. This is the highest number of gates that have been opened since the 1997 event. So early January was extremely wet in California, and with more wet weather on the way, it is important to stay prepared. For tips on staying prepared for flooding, please visit floodprepareca.com.
Okay, so what does all this mean for the drought?
January 27th.
Well, in the last week, the State Water Project announced a 60% allocation for its contractors, which was up from an initial allocation of 20% on November 28th. Also, next week, the State Water Resources Control Board is scheduled to vote on permanently locking in some conservation measures that grew out of the drought. Those likely will include a requirement that the 400 largest cities, water companies, and water districts in California continue to publicly report their water use to the state every month. And that exceptionally wasteful water practices like hosing down sidewalks or washing cars without nozzles on the hose are permanently banned. It's part of the administration's California Water Action Plan tenet to make conservation a California way of life, and of course is generally consistent with the Delta Plan as we seek to reduce reliance on the Delta and improve statewide water supply reliability. You've got one letter in your packet that I wanted to highlight as a Delta Plan implementation and coordination letter this month. It was actually sent December 28th to the Western Canal Water District, and the project that they are proposing is a long-term water transfer from a water district and an irrigation district in the north to possible receiving agencies south of the Delta in the Bay Area, Central Valley, or Southern California. The project is important because the long-term transfer of water may have impacts in the Delta. And should this project meet the definition of a covered action, it would trigger several of the Delta Plan's regulatory policies. Last year, we moved to exempt one-year water transfers from the Delta Plan, but long-term transfers are possibly subject to Delta Plan consistency requirements. On personnel, we're pleased to welcome Senior Engineer Erin Mullen to the agency. Erin is a graduate of UC Davis, and she has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. She began her career with the state at the Department of Water Resources in 2006. And during her time there, she worked on state federal flood control projects, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and most recently managing various engineering and environmental studies for the department in the Delta. Join me in welcoming Erin to our team when you see her. I don't think she's in the audience today. On today's agenda, staff will present the Council's 2016 annual report and will highlight accomplishments from the 2016 Council priorities that were set at the beginning of last year. And then we'll provide you an update on conversations and information that you requested related to the Delta Levy investment strategy. And with that, I'll pass it over to Bethany for our legal update.
Thank you, Jessica. Mr. Chair and members, today Adam Silva has 2 cases of interest to share with you.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini, members of the Council. Our first case we will be discussing today is the Klamath Irrigation et al. Versus the United States. On December 21st of 2016, Judge Marion Blankhorn of the United States Court of Federal Claims granted the plaintiff's motion and ruled that the government's denial of the plaintiff's water should be analyzed under a physical takings rubric. Now, the plaintiffs in this case are individual landowners, irrigation districts, and other organizations in Oregon and California who receive water diverted from the Klamath River and Upper Klamath Lake. The plaintiffs allege that the defendant, acting through the United States Bureau of Reclamation, effected a taking of their alleged water rights in 2001. Now, as a result of critically dry conditions in 2001, the United States Bureau of Reclamation terminated delivery of water from the Upper Klamath Lake and the Klamath River to the plaintiffs until July of that year, which the plaintiffs allege is too late in the growing season to effectively grow crops. The plaintiffs filed their initial complaint in October of 2001, claiming that the government's actions in terminating these deliveries constituted a taking of their alleged water rights in violation of the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the parties here filed cross motions. The plaintiffs argued that their claims should be analyzed under a physical takings rubric, and the defendant argued that the claims should be analyzed as regulatory takings. Now, a physical taking requires physical occupation or destruction of property, while a regulatory taking involves restrictions on the use of property. And the distinction between the two is important because a physical taking constitutes a per se taking and imposes a categorical duty on the government to compensate the injured owner, while a regulatory taking is a lot more complicated and requires balancing and complex factual assessments. So, citing other pertinent cases, the court determined that a physical taking involves instances where the U.S. physically diverts water or causes water to be diverted away from the owner's property such that the owner's right to use that water is forever gone. Here, the court reasoned that because the government's actions by refusing to release water from the Upper Klamath Lake and the Klamath River prevented the water from flowing to the plaintiffs, the court granted the plaintiff's motion and determined that the actions should be analyzed under a physical takings rubric. It should be noted that this decision in no way makes any determinations as to the nature or scope of the plaintiff's alleged water rights, and those remain at issue. The second case we'll be discussing is the Catskill Mountains chapter of Trout Unlimited Incorporated versus the United States Environmental Protection Agency. This case helps improve our understanding of applicable laws surrounding water transfers. On January 18, 2017, Judges Robert Sack, Denny Chin, and Susan Carney of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit reversed a district court ruling and upheld the U.S. EPA's rule that water transfers are not subject to the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System's permitting process. In 2008, the EPA promulgated the Water Transfers Rule, which declared that water transfers are not subject to NPDES permitting processes as established by the Clean Water Act. Now, numerous plaintiffs challenged the rule, and the district court vacated the rule after declaring that it was based on an unreasonable interpretation of the Clean Water Act. The Court of Appeals, however, concluded that the rule was based on a reasonable interpretation and was entitled to what's known as a Chevron deference. Courts will assume that agencies are better equipped to make difficult policy choices and will defer to agency judgments if a two-part test known as the Chevron test is satisfied. Under Part 1 of the Chevron test, courts look to see whether Congress has clearly and unambiguously spoken directly to the precise issue through statutes. If yes, and the intent of Congress is clear, that is the end of the matter. The courts will courts will follow what Congress has said. Here, though, the court noted that while sections 301, 402, and 502 of the Clean Water Act forbid discharge of pollutants into navigable waters, they do not speak directly as to whether an NPDES permit is required for water transfers. So the court concluded that because Congress had not, here through the Clean Water Act, spoken directly to the issue, that they should proceed to step 2 of the Chevron test. Now, under Part 2 of the Chevron test, the court will examine whether the agency's determination is based on a permissible construction of the statute and not arbitrary, capricious, or manifestly contrary to the implementing statute. And if so, the court will defer to the agency's judgment and interpretation of the statute. So here the court determined that the EPA did provide reasonable justification, including Congress's intent to leave primary oversight of water transfers to state authorities, and that subjecting water transfers to NPDES permitting could affect the state's ability to effectively allocate water and water rights. So the court concluded that the rule also satisfied Part 2 of the Chevron test. So the court concluded that because Congress had not spoken directly to the issue at hand in the Clean Water Act, and that the EPA had provided reasonable justification for the rule, the court held that the EPA was entitled to the Chevron deference and reinstated the rule that water transfers are not subject to the NPDES permitting requirements. So we will continue to monitor these cases and other pertinent cases, and we look forward to our next legal update in February. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions of Adam?
In the Klamath case, what's happening next?
The case is scheduled to go to trial in this month. I was unable to find the exact date, but I'll keep looking as to where it goes from here.
And if it's a physical taking, are they talking about what the damages are, or is the regulatory taking issue still before the court?
They just determined here that they're just going to analyze it under a physical taking. They still have to go forward and go through that analysis.
As to whether it's regulatory? Because there's more water now, and I would think that the plaintiffs are going to not have the same situation this year that they had. When was it, 2001?
This was back in 2001. The procedural history is very long and complicated, and this particular segment was just debating between the physical and regulatory rubrics, and they decided on a physical rubric, and I think the next hearing in this month, they'll start moving forward and applying that rubric.
So if I can interrupt, the physical taking analysis will proceed at the trial court, and only after the ruling, to the extent to which there was or wasn't a physical taking will damages be assessed at the end of that trial.
isn't the bigger issue possible here, whether it's regulatory, meaning can a state or federal agency restrict water, change the flows based on available water and competing needs?
Right,
Right.
and we're tracking this case, so we're tracking this case for both reasons. One, to see how, if the physical takings analysis proceeds, how that turns out, and whether or not the determination that it's physical versus regulatory ends up getting appealed. We'll be tracking that as well, so that we can report back to you.
So are the implications potentially in California that if it's a physical taking, there'll be assertions of water rights, and when the state or federal projects cut back or limit below whatever the contracted amount is,
That could be
it'll
one of...
be challenged under potentially this court case or the logic of this court case that the government owes them money?
That could be one of the implications that we're tracking, yes. That would be a long time off, but that's why we're following this case so closely, yeah.
Ken?
Just quickly, it seems sort of counterintuitive that a water transfer would be considered a discharge. I mean, I could see if it winds up going in a reservoir and it's a change of source. And how did that, I mean, why would you even, I don't think that's ever been raised in California.
I think one of the concerns for the parties challenging the rule was that if you transfer water from one body to another, it could be bringing in invasive species or other substances that the water body receiving that transfer is not used to or not capable of handling. So I think that was one of their issues.
Anything else? Good job, Adam. Thanks.
Okay, and next, call up Ryan Stambrough for the legislative update.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. Welcome to Supervisor Thompson. This morning I'll start off with news from Capitol Hill. As you'll likely recall, last month Congress passed and President Obama signed into law the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act for the nation. In addition to serving as the primary vehicle for authorizing projects to be studied, planned, and developed by the U.S. Army Corps, S612 included a rider to address the state's ongoing drought. The development and passage of the drought language is the latest iteration in a years-long negotiation that has been marked by a number of efforts by members from both sides of the aisle. Major highlights of the California-related provisions include requiring the use of hatcheries to enhance and rebuild delta smelt, authorizing agencies to temporarily increase pumping beyond what is allowed under the current biological opinions during winter storm events to capture excess flow, a savings clause that explicitly prevents the applicable provisions of the legislation from violating state or federal laws, including the Endangered Species Act and the biological opinions, and more than $500 million in congressional authorizations that would largely be for storage projects, but also does include $43 million in ecosystem-related authorizations for increasing salmon spawning habitat, purchasing water to increase flows for fish, installation of fish screens, enhanced delta smelt monitoring, and the development of a program to reduce predation and invasive species. On a related note, earlier this month, Congressman David Valadao, a Republican from Hanford, introduced House Resolution 23 as Congress just kicked off the new session. This is known as the Gaining Responsibility on Water Act, or the GROW Act. On the face, this bill shares a number of similarities with past water-related efforts by the congressman. Specifically, H.R. 23 would attempt to streamline the dam approval process by providing the Bureau of Reclamation with oversight for coordinating local, state, and federal permitting of new dams, impose deadlines to finish feasibility studies on proposals for the sites and temperance flat projects, amend the Endangered Species Act to equate wild fish with hatchery fish for the purposes of compliance. And finally, 4, it would codify the 1994 Bay Delta Accord, which, as you'll recall, was an agreement between state and federal agencies to coordinate delta water use and water quality standards. The Accord also did include delta export targets and an express desire to improve operational flexibility in support of enhancing water supply reliability, among other things. With the bill's introduction coming just a few weeks ago, it's obviously early in the process, and I'll report back to the council on its progress as appropriate. Moving on to recent events here in Sacramento, on January the 4th, the state legislature convened to formally kick off the 2017-2018 legislative session. A few things of note as the new session starts. One is the significant amount of turnover in the new membership, with 31 new members assuming office in December, as well as the fact that Democrats regained a supermajority in both houses as a result of November elections, which, as the council is likely aware, is the threshold required to do things like pass taxes and enact urgency statutes. Also of note is the chairmanship changes of the policy committees relevant to the council's interests and issues. Specifically, Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia, a Democrat from the Coachella Valley, is the new chair of the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee, replacing Assembly Member Mark Levine. And Senator Bob Hertzberg, a Democrat from Van Nuys and former Assembly Speaker, has assumed the chairmanship of the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, replacing a termed-out Fran Pavley. And also, Senator Bill Dodd now holds the District 3 seat, which encompasses a substantial portion of the Delta and was previously held by Lois Wolk, who also turned out at the end of last year. With the current bill introduction deadline set for February the 17th, we are in the early stages of the bill cycle, so I'll have a much more thorough presentation on relevant state measures in my presentation next month. And then finally this morning, Governor Brown issued his proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year earlier this month. The $179.5 billion budget is up 5% from the current fiscal year's budget. However, the governor did underscore the importance of continuing fiscal prudence ahead of the projection of the state running a $1.6 billion deficit by as soon as next summer. And also, he did point out the possibility of another economic downturn around the corner. While the council is not seeking additional resources through the budget change proposal process this year, I did want to highlight a few other agencies' proposals this morning. DWR is seeking $3.5 million to continue implementation of its smelt resiliency strategy, with funds going towards things like aquatic weed control and food web enhancement in the Delta. In addition, DWR and the Department of Fish and Wildlife are seeking a combined $21 million to fund drought response and resiliency measures, including enhanced real-time acoustic monitoring in the Delta, fish rescue and relocation, and the establishment of the Drought Management Operations Center, which will, among other things, lead a multi-agency drought operations team in overseeing Delta water supply, water quality, and environmental drought impacts. Obviously, in the coming months, the legislature will begin to consider these proposals, and I will follow up as things progress. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation.
Ryan, thank you. Any questions of Ryan?
Sorry if I missed it, but did you mention the upcoming hearing, or is that? I can't remember.
No, that hasn't been noticed
Okay.
yet. So.
We've heard that there may be a hearing in February on a status update of water fix, and if that occurs, then Chairman Fiorini would appear, but we're waiting on confirmation for that.
Okay. Ryan, thank you very much.
Okay, and then lastly, As we've agreed, we've prepared a quarterly contract update that's included in your packet, and as always, should you have any questions about that, I or staff are happy to respond. And with that, unless there are any questions, it concludes my executive officer's report.
Any questions of Jessica? None. Thank you very much. Pat, any requests for public comment? No, none. All right, on to file item number 9, lead scientist report. Pinch hitting for Dr. Cliff Dahm is Dr. Reiner Honecke, our Deputy Executive Officer of the Science Program. Reiner, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair and council members, and welcome, Mr. Thompson, as a new member on the council. It's my pleasure to fill in for Cliff, who is giving a presentation in Puerto Rico. Cliff asked me to share with you 8 science-related items. One of them, actually, Jessica did a really great job in filling you in already, so I will try to shorten my report a little bit. It was the update on the most recent major rain events in January and also in December. In my own experiences, was only the second time that my rain gauge that only holds 3 inches per day flowed over. So there were quite a few major events there, and it was impressive. First, I want to brief you on collaborative science activities. The State Water Board asked the science program to facilitate and to convene an independent panel to review their Sacramento water allocation model, commonly known as SACWAM. So if you run across that acronym, it's the Sacramento Water Allocation Model. The completed report entitled Independent Peer Review of the Sacramento Water Allocation Model is posted online. You can find it on our website. The link is in your staff report in the package under item 9. It's hydrology or a systems operations model developed by the Stockholm Environmental Institute and the State Water Board to assess potential revisions to in-stream flow and other requirements in the water quality control plan for the San Francisco Bay and Delta estuary plan. SACWAM is intended to be user-friendly and easy to accept various scenarios. Independent peer review of the model was conducted for transparency and to confirm the robustness of the model for applications related to updates to the Bay Delta plan. And the peer review panel found that the approach used to develop the model was generally very appropriate, but they cautioned against use of the model in dry or critically dry years and for smaller non-water project related tributaries at this time. In particular, they identified concerns regarding the calibration and validation of the model, especially for low flow periods, the lack of studies assessing the model's sensitivity to different conditions and calculating uncertainties for estimations. And the third concern was that there's a need for model enhancements and additional documentation. So we'll find out to what extent these recommendations will actually be used to improve the model over time. The panel also noted that limitations on the model's ability to represent interactions among streams and aquifers and to provide a broad assessment of delta water quality, given that the San Joaquin River is not part of the model. Very useful recommendations to the State Water Board to enhance the model over time, and that is something that we will keep track of too. Under the science program. The second piece that I want to brief you on is the Delta Science Fellowship applications that came in. They're currently in review, and last week we convened a panel of reviewers for the 18 applications that came in last year. 8 predoctoral and 10 postdoctoral applications were received, and we expect to fund between 7 and 10, depending on funding availability and support from other agencies that might want to sponsor one or more of those fellows. The applications were reviewed last week, and funding decisions will be made by the lead scientist based on input from those independent science reviews. We expect awards to be issued by early March, and then we'll have another cohort of young science fellows contributing to critical management decisions here in the Delta and beyond. So these fellowships receive up to 2 years of funding for salary, research supplies, equipment, and travel. And it's a cooperative effort between the Delta Science Program and the California Sea Grant. Since 2003, we've been bringing together junior scientists with Delta agency scientists and senior research mentors to work collaboratively on high-priority data analysis and research projects. So for this round of fellowships, applicants to the program were asked to write research proposals addressing one or more of 4 high-priority research topics that also have been vetted with the Delta Agency Science Work Group that our implementation committee empowered to work with us. And all of these research topics have direct management applications to Delta issues. They range from assessing the effects of extreme events, not just drought, but also flood and seismic events on the Delta, the effectiveness and implications of habitat restoration actions, life histories, habitat requirements and food webs of Delta estuarine and migratory species in a changing landscape, and lastly, science supporting the enhancement and protection of the cultural, recreational, natural resource, and agricultural values in the Delta. And we got some really interesting proposals in, and I think in February, Cliff might be able to brief you more on the topics that were selected and how our fellows will produce good work in the next 2 years. And with that, I'd like to actually introduce, this is a good segue, to introduce you to one of our former science fellows. Those of you who have been on the council for some time might remember we were exactly in this room in 2013 when, and Phil Eisenberg was still chair at that time, when a line of, Rachel, remind me, about 13 or so science fellows were lined up, and Rachel Wiggins was among them. And they had a chance to give the council sort of 2-minute summaries of what they were going to do. Rachel was among them, and she's back here to tell you what actually happened to her during the 2 years that she was a science fellow. And the reason why we invited her to give you a chance to see her very condensed presentation is because she won the first prize of the student presentations at the Bay Delta Science Conference that took place last November. So welcome, Rachel. Rachel Wigginton is currently still working on her PhD at UC Davis, and her presentation and an update to you on how relevant her research really is deals with understanding a drought-induced dieback of pepperweed in an invaded tidal marsh. And we thought it had particular relevance on sort of the relationship to the Delta Plan policy that deals with invasive species and how to help restoration managers and restoration practitioners to comply with that policy. So with that, please welcome Rachel Wigginton, and with that, I'll give you the stage.
Excellent. Thank you all for giving me the chance to speak with you today. As was said, I'm talking about my work looking at the relationship between drought and an invasive weed, Lepidium latifolium, or pepperweed, in invaded tidal marshes of the San Francisco Bay Delta. Oh,
Rachel, I have a hand.
Oh, I worked it out. I am actually getting a doctorate. So I don't think I have to sell to anyone in this room the importance of tidal marshes. These are systems that provide a lot of ecosystem services, everything from filtering stormwater to storing carbon. But these systems are actually particularly vulnerable to colonization by non-native plants that can then become problematic, and we consider them invasive weeds. So wetlands globally cover a really small percentage of the land surface area of the planet, but 24% of the most invasive weeds are actually invaders of wetland habitats. So these habitats are really vulnerable to this particular sort of perturbation. And sort of to add insult to injury, a lot of these invasive plants often act as ecosystem engineers, which is an organism, either native or non-native, that comes into a system and really significantly alters aspects of the habitat. And when these alterations come from non-native species, we might consider that some of these changes could be problematic for our native species that we're interested in. And one of these invasive plant ecosystem engineers that I'm particularly interested in is Lepidium latifolium. The common name is perennial pepperweed or white top. And within tidal marshes, Lepidium has been shown to alter marsh environment, changing environmental conditions under the plant canopy. It reduces the production of native plants, and then it can even alter the community mixtures of native plants and invertebrates, which are really important food sources to other organisms that we're interested in conserving and managing, like fish and birds. And I think that this is particularly relevant to this group because my work informs ERP5 and ERR7 from the Delta Plan, which are concerned with management of non-native species within the Delta. And Lepidium is actually a widespread invader in the Delta, colonizing habitats from tidal marshes to riparian areas. And in part because of its large distribution, it interacts with lots of endangered, threatened, and special concern species in these systems. But control and eradication of this weed is really difficult and time-consuming, making it particularly expensive. So my research tells us that drought may actually be negatively impacting these Lepidium populations. So incorporating this knowledge of how drought might be altering Lepidium populations could really increase the efficiency of our control efforts by allowing us to sort of strike when the plant might be at a vulnerable moment in its life cycle. And also understanding this relationship between drought and invasive species generally could really inform restoration planning and maintenance of restoration plans by understanding what points we could enact our restoration sort of plans when invasive species are particularly less susceptible to invading these systems. So as I said, I did observe a dieback of Lepidium that co-occurred with the drought in California. So here I'm showing you a graphic where we have Lepidium stem density on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. And you'll see that from 2014 to 2015, we saw a significant reduction in Lepidium stem density. And both of these are drought years, but during 2015, we saw little to no precipitation during particularly important moments in Lepidium's life cycle. So we think that this dieback might have actually been related to the drought. And not only did we see change in Lepidium stem density, but stem height was also significantly decreased. Here you'll see a picture of one of my collaborators, Megan Kelso, who is a current Delta Science predoctoral fellow. And you'll see that she's holding a stem of Lepidium from 2014 that's dead. And I've marked a growing stem from the 2015 year. So it's a significant decrease in density and height. So we hypothesized that last year during the El Nino, when we were getting significant freshwater input through rain, we'd actually see a recovery of Lepidium stem density. But that is actually not what we observed. So again, we see stem density on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. And you'll see in that 2016 year when we had our El Nino, stem density of Lepidium didn't recover to the 2014 densities that we initially observed. And this, I've been showing you data just from one of the sites that we're monitoring, but here's data from two other sites, so one site in dark gray and another site in light gray. And though there's site variability, we see in multiple sites across the San Francisco Bay Delta complex that Lepidium stem density still hasn't recovered. So we're seeing a lag in stem density recovery in this invasive weed, and we hypothesize this might have something to do with salinity changes, but we're not really sure if that's salinity mediated by rainwater, freshwater input, or because of overall changes in bay water salinity, which has something to do with climate change. So just some management takeaways from all this. Lepidia might be experiencing a multi-year dieback, which is possibly due to the drought. And we could really coordinate our management and restoration efforts around this knowledge of how drought interacts with these invasive species, not just Lepidia and potentially others if we were to look at other invasive plants in the system. But we still don't really know what the mechanism for this dieback was. We hypothesize it's salinity, but we're not really sure because we are going to be monitoring again this year, which is also a wet year, so we also don't know what the impact of multiple wet years will have on this. And so this is just an acknowledgement slide, but I wanted to point out that 2 of the young women featured here were actually paid through my Delta Science predoctoral fellowship, so they're undergraduates that I mentored, and so it increases the impact of your all's money. And I'll take any questions if we have time.
Any questions? Patrick, and then Ken.
During a drought, when there's a dieback, what are the strategies that might work to make sure that pepperweed doesn't come back when it rains?
Right, so the major control strategies that people use on Lepidium, and I'm not necessarily an expert on this, but it's mostly herbicide application. And so when you have these decreased densities, that might be a good time to go on in there and apply herbicides, because Lepidium is particularly hard to control because it stores a lot of energy below ground in its roots. So you have to multiple years come in and take away the above ground matter to deplete those energy stores. So when you already have sort of depleted energy because of the drought, that might be a good time to come in.
Beat them while they're down. That's
Ken?
Yeah, no, that was going to be one of my questions. But, looking at the dieback from Lepidium, is it significantly different than native species under stress from, drought? I mean, is it significantly more so for the Lepidium?
So we didn't observe a decrease in native plant percent cover during the drought, and this could be because these native plants are already adapted to these higher salinity conditions in the tidal marshes, so not getting this freshwater input due to rain might actually not harm them as much. So if you bring those 2 things together, you could really get a chance to manage and control the Lepidium and allow the native plants to sort of recover.
So get them when their defenses are down and let the natives, creep back in and take control.
Yeah, I think that's the major takeaway.
Okay.
Others?
Nice jacket.
Thanks.
It's good for me, having been here when you first passed through, describing what you were going to do and now hearing what you've done. I think this is an opportunity to develop leadership around Delta-related science, and at the same time providing us useful information as decision makers to guide our policy decisions. So, Reiner, thank you for arranging for Rachel to be here, and Rachel, thank you for your good work.
Thank you very much.
Rachel, just a quick question from me. So Megan Kelso is a current science fellow. Is she going to follow up on all the questions that you posed in your final slide, or in your second to the last slide, or some of them at least?
Megan is particularly interested in carbon sequestration, so we collaborated on a lot of our field work. But so she is interested in this drought-induced dieback, but particularly interested, I was talking about those below-ground root stores. That's where a lot of the carbon is stored by this invasive plant. So understanding how this decrease in stem density might correlate with changing below-ground carbon storage.
Great.
So it's a larger-scale climate change question.
Great. Thank you. And Cliff told me that he'd love to bring back the next generation from the next cohort to, if there's an opportunity. So thank you very much, Rachel. Just the next portion that Cliff asked me to just give you quick highlights about is on science communication. So he asked me to let you know about 2 key papers that have recently been published. One is particularly relevant to water supply reliability, and probably will have some relevance to the CSO, the Conveyance Operations and Storage Amendment to the Delta Plan that we have planned. It was written by a team that was led by Phil Bachand. our own Nicole Stern, who works for the science program, was a co-author on this one, and it covered a sort of this challenge of what can we do when there are really high flows coming down the Sierra that would otherwise either cause flood damage or couldn't be captured in a way that made sense. So this paper actually talks about a pilot project where on-farm flood capture was used as not just a temporary storage compartment to prevent flood damage where we don't want it, but also to show the potential for groundwater replenishment and overdraft mitigation. So the pilot study flooded 1,000-acre plot in the Kings River Basin, and they modeled or projected or forecast that if this were done at the 30,000-acre scale for on-farm flood capture, that it has the capacity to capture 80% of flood flow and possibly offsetting much of the overdraft in the Kings River groundwater basin. So that was one of those studies where that included resource economics, hydrology, and agricultural practices and values. So an example of sort of multidisciplines coming together and creating a story that was very positive, I thought. And then I wanted to mention that in the December issue of the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal, which the Council helps fund, the final installment of the State of Bay Delta Science papers appeared, and one of them dealt with recent advances in understanding flow dynamics and transport of water quality constituents in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. In the interest of time, I just want to get right to the bottom line of what why that paper is relevant. It basically just pointed out that our state of knowledge has grown considerably in recent years, but there's still a couple of questions that we need to answer. And those are, what are the current and historical sources of sediment? We're particularly interested in sediment because it could counteract sea level rise and help tidal marsh keep track and keep pace with sea level rise. Therefore, we need to figure out a little bit more of what current sources of sediment are and why sediment supply in the Delta have decreased so much over the last 50 years. It's not just, it's probably a combination of many things, among them that sediment gets retained behind the dams, the rim dams in the Sierra, but there's probably more to it than that. An examination of accumulated sediment profiles could help determine different sediment sources. And then what are the effects of greater water residence time for the food web and toxic contaminants? So during drought years, we have a lot more stagnant water, and how can we possibly mitigate that or deal with it? And how has turbidity changed since the gold rush when delta smelt were more abundant? And also, how does a sediment input and turbidity affect submerged aquatic vegetation, and how does that vegetation alter sediment transport? And are there cool water temperature zones within the delta that may benefit native fish? And we've heard in previous council meetings when Cliff talked about some of the findings that from previous editions of the State of Bay Delta Science that came out before December. And then quickly just to mention that we also had a brown bag seminar that was also part of the series of papers or covered one of the papers that was published in the State of Bay Delta Science. Food webs in the Delta, Suisun Bay and Suisun Marsh, an update on current understanding possibilities for management, and I will refer you to the write-up in your binder just to make sure that we get through this in due time and nobody goes hungry. We've already, or Jessica's already covered the storm events that are also alluded to in the staff report. So I will just refer you to the final item here, and that is the by the numbers. And I just wanted to thank Lauren Yamani, whose fellowship as a state fellow in our agency will end at the end of this month. This will be her last time that she will be that she will have the chance to present to you the by the numbers statistics. And Lauren is not going very far. She will undertake a postdoc fellowship at UC Davis, and we wish her luck. So please join me in thanking Lauren for her tenure here and her great contributions she made to the science program.
We'll wait till after she makes her report.
Yep.
All right.
Which, by the way, you're really going out on a high note.
I know. This is great news for everyone. Well, thank you, Reiner, and good morning, Chair Fiorini and council members. So we've already heard a little bit about the recent rainfall and the atmospheric river events that have brought about these high water resource levels for this month, but I'm going to expand upon them a little bit more. So you'll see that all of the color ratings this month on By the Numbers are now green, and they've switched from a mix of ratings, so that's good news for everyone. Starting with precipitation, cumulative rainfall increased by close to 30 inches in the northern Sierra, and that's only been since December 14th, the last time that I provided this report. Rainfall has also increased by 31 inches in the central Sierra. Cumulative rainfall at these sites is therefore more than double the average for this time of year. Okay. So snowpack in the Sierra is often called the state's largest reservoir. The snow water equivalent increased by 21 inches in the northern Sierra and by 28 inches in the central Sierra since the last report. The state average has also increased by 26 inches. Whereas previously snowpack was about half to 3/4 of the average last month, these numbers are now 160 to 190% of their average to date. Okay, moving on to water supply. Reservoir storage at Shasta, Oroville, and San Luis have all filled up. Storage at Shasta increased by 14% of its average storage since last month. At Oroville, storage has increased by over 25% since December 14th, and that shifts its rating from poor to good. San Luis Reservoir storage increased by close to 45%. Turning to flow and water quality, flow for the Sacramento River at Freeport was at 78% of the monthly average last month, and it's now at over 200% of the January average. Salinity last month there was good, and it's good again this month. Flow in the San Joaquin River at Vernalis last month was at 34%, and was considered bad, but since the last report has increased by over 200% of its average to date. Whereas salinity was poor at Vernalis last month, it's dropped by close to 640 conductivity units and now has a rating of good. At the Central Valley Project and State Water Project pumps, exports increased by 25% of the average to date, and salinity has decreased correspondingly by close to 300 conductivity units there. Okay, so last month I promised that we would have some smelt numbers for you this time around. So the final indices for the fall midwater trawl for Delta and Longfin smelt, which was basically a survey originally developed to assess the number of young striped bass, but it's now also used to survey smelt. Those numbers have been released by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The annual index here is calculated from monthly indices from September through December. And just as a reminder, these are not absolute measures of abundance, but rather a relative measure of the number of subadults. Next month, we are probably going to start reporting on the spring Kodiak trawl surveys, which provide estimates of the numbers of spawning adults for Delta smelt. So for 2016, the fall midwater trawl index of abundance was 8 for Delta smelt. And you can kind of look at the trends over time in that first graphic. And then for longfin smelt, the index of abundance for the fall midwater trawl was 7. And in both cases, these indices are the second lowest on record. And so that concludes by the numbers. Thank you very much.
Any questions of Lauren? Lauren, thank you very much.
All right,
Best wishes.
Thank you. Okay.
Reiner, anything else?
No, other than any questions that may have come up in the meantime, I'd be happy to answer any.
Looks like you satisfied everyone. So thank you very much.
All
Good
right,
report.
thank you.
All right, we are now on to file item 10, year in review.
Okay, thanks. Well, hopefully a little bit of good news in this item, and so I'll draw your attention to item 10. There's a staff report, and then additionally, there are copies of the report itself, which was just published within the last week or so. And so I'm here to kind of give you an overview of what we learned as we took a look back at 2016, and then to also invite some of my senior staff up to the table to share some of their stories as well. Since the Delta Plan's adoption in May of 2013, we've published end-of-year progress reports on its implementation. The idea isn't just to highlight the work of the council staff, but also to highlight activity across agencies that furthers the plan and the co-equal goals. Each year, we've been able to rely a little bit more on our plan's performance measures to tell the story, and actually today we'll debut our tracking system for what we're calling our administrative performance measures, which specifically track Delta Plan recommended actions. So this review is born out of our work plan for last year, and it also sets the stage for staff to bring to you next month our 2017 recommended work plan and priorities for your consideration. So I'm always pleased to have the opportunity to report on how we're keeping our commitments as we were established to promote a new level of transparency and accountability when it comes to Delta activity. It's also an opportunity to showcase the hard work of our staff and our partners. So I'll begin by stepping back and providing the background. 2016, as we all remember, was another year affected by drought. Californians reduced water use by more than 20%, and they continued that even after those mandatory requirements were lifted. Regions began development of sustainable groundwater management plans. Excuse me. But we know that replenishing the drawdown, particularly in the southern San Joaquin Valley, is likely to take years of normal and above normal surface water supply. Although reservoir levels recovered thanks to an increased snowpack in 2016, the year was somewhat textbook in its illustration of the balance between the co-equal goals, which is that more precipitation in the system does not neatly equate to more reliable supplies for all end users. Also in 2016, Prop 1 bond money began to flow in earnest, and while we were not personally charged with distributing these funds, we were able to work with our partners at the Delta Conservancy and also at the Department of Fish and Wildlife in order to maximize benefits for their Delta-specific solicitations. And I'm really impressed with their efforts, and I'm excited to see the fruit of those investments. Before I go on, I always feel like it's worth reflecting on the unique role that the council plays in the Delta landscape. So going back to the Reform Act, the legislature intended us as a new governance structure with the authority, responsibility, accountability, scientific support, and secure funding to achieve specific inherent objectives, which were listed as water supply reliability, ecosystem restoration, water quality, and delta as place considerations. Fundamentally, we pursue those inherent objectives in two major ways. One is we develop and implement an enforceable management plan for the delta. And then, of course, we connect the best available science to the decision makers who can use it. We do those two things through a range of activities. The Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee in 2016 brought together federal and state leaders specifically to identify ways to break through barriers for achieving ecosystem restoration projects, and also to coordinate in pursuit of high priority science, which was intended to inform both ongoing and forthcoming water policy decisions. This year, DPIC furthered the vision of One Delta, One Science by co-hosting, along with the U.S. Geological Survey, a workshop to better understand how collaborative science is being managed, funded, and communicated in several high-profile and equally complex systems across the United States. Lessons learned from that are being compiled now and will be presented to the DPIC in April. The Implementation Committee has also been an important venue for communicating this science that supports decision-making and restoration in the Delta. This year, this was done through expert presentations and discussion on adaptive management and the practitioner-focused Delta Renewed report, as well as through a continued focus on eco-restore implementation, which I argue is one of 2016's great success stories. We also have a role to ensure consistency with our Delta Plan. Last year, 4 projects filed Delta Plan consistency determinations. Our staff were also engaged in various levels of early consultation on more than a dozen additional projects. We also worked quite successfully with San Joaquin County on their general plan update in order to protect nearly 2,000 acres of Delta farmland that had been proposed for conversion, and to ensure overall Delta Plan consistency for their update. And those are details that we reported to you in the fall. Another role of the council is to inform. We're always interested in finding new ways to reach our audiences effectively, and to, in doing so, to supply useful information, not just our science products, but also sharing events and public engagement opportunities. So last year, we notably debuted an online Delta project tracking database, which is accessible to the public and relies on information that is submitted by our partner agencies as well as tracked by our staff. We undertook a concerted effort last year to increase our social media presence. We began an Instagram account and more than doubled our Twitter followers, and the intent there is really to drive people to the council's website for information about events, new science and policy reports, and also to engage with the council on implementation of the Delta Plan and its amendments. We ditched our quarterly email newsletters in favor of short video blogs in order to highlight the work of the council in various arenas. The intent here is really to put a face on some of the work that we do and help people understand its implications in a more relatable way. And that also facilitates our use of social media as people increasingly consume videos through their accounts. Mid last year, we began bi-monthly webcasting of the Delta Independent Science Board in addition to our monthly meetings. And while sometimes there are 30 people in the audience, we know that we have another 100 to 200 watching online in real time. And of course, our meetings are archived so that they are accessible after the fact. And people often mention that they've gone back to watch a particular part of a meeting or a presentation or check a fact. And so we know that those are serving a purpose. I'm particularly proud of that aspect and how we do business, and I receive a lot of feedback from others who are as well. As Deputy for Science Reiner will discuss, we've also fulfilled our Inform role through our science program activities. We had 9 brown bag seminars, 9 workshops and conferences, a joint symposium, and 2 independent science reviews in 2016. And this year, and also a particularly important series of science synthesis reports, which you've been hearing a lot about, the state of Bay Delta science. In addition to early consultations, our job as staff implementing the Delta Plan is to track and evaluate projects that affect the Delta, whether they're covered actions or not. So our engagement here occurs through face-to-face meetings and through formal letters as part of the environmental review under CEQA. And this year we sent over 24 letters, but spent many more hours on the phone or meeting with various project proponents in order to better understand their goals for their project, but also to better explain ours. So I'm going to stop there and give staff the floor for a few brief comments, and then we'll move on to our demonstration of our performance measures dashboard. Reiner?
Thank you, Jessica. I just want to highlight a couple items that were really instrumental in getting to enhance the focus on research, on critical science investigations. As many of you know, the legislature approved additional funding for that particular aspect of the role of the science program, and we managed to award about a little more than $4 million, $4.5 million to not just through our collaboration with the California Sea Grant program and funding science fellows, but also to piggyback on the Proposition 1 solicitation that for the Fish and Wildlife Department for that chapter in the legislation that deals with supporting the Delta Science Plan. So we implemented a number of high priority actions that also were had been endorsed by the implementation committee prior to that, and implemented major investigation and syntheses on science topics that were of high relevance. These all related to assessing drought-related effects on the Delta, effectiveness and implications of habitat restoration actions, and science support for management of estuarine and migratory species. So we also, one thing that we're particularly proud of, we completed the 2016 State of Bay Delta Science. And really the purpose of that is to assess what have we learned over the last decade or so. We're trying to sort of narrow or shorten that period where we do these synthetic investigations to every 4 years. So we'll see, this was our first effort since 2008, where we just asked the question, what have we learned since then? And we really briefly categorize them into major, or 6 or 7 major areas where our knowledge has increased considerably, and that we can now apply in our management and policy decisions. One deals with the issue of contaminant cocktails. In fact, next week we will have a synthesis symposium on this very issue of the interactive effects on valued ecosystem components, and to some extent on potential exposure to human health too. And we've come a long way to increase our knowledge on methyl mercury, on industrial chemicals, pharmaceutical products, and you name it, and what role they have in these multiple stressors that affect fish, wildlife, and to some extent potentially humans too. We learned a lot about food web changes, and you got a quick glimpse in detail with the pepperweed talk earlier that Rachel provided. So one of the chapters deals with that. We also have a chapter, and we've learned a lot about the multiple and interactive stressors on native species, on extreme conditions, especially the ones that we are, experiencing now, atmospheric rivers, long droughts, and probably anticipating increases in these extreme events as we move on. Another piece that we synthesized was restoration, and how we need to consider not just parcel by parcel of how effective our actions are in restoring individual parcels, but also how do they fit into the landscape context. And I think there is a whole area of movement in that and increase in our knowledge that was sort of summarized in this report that was recently released, entitled Delta Renewed. Sort of the vision of where we might go and use that knowledge to look at landscape level or large scale restoration pieces and how those respond to our expectations. And then obviously we couldn't avoid that, unfortunately, but a big chapter also dealt with the decline in native fish species and sort of forecasting what we might do to avoid extinction, or at least draw it out some more. And then obviously also importance of nutrients. Our knowledge has increased significantly there, and the role of nutrients in generating harmful algal blooms, and what the link is between our invasive submerged and floating aquatic vegetation. And so it was just a real a demonstration of how important that synthesis is. And much of that was also dealt with at the 9th biennial-based Delta Science Conference, including a town hall meeting on building the 2017 Science Action Agenda, lessons learned from integrating science into policy decisions, and a really informative panel discussion about the art of interpreting complex science for policymakers. Some of you were there, and hopefully you got some value out of it. Our next Bay Delta Science Conference will be 2 years from now, and we are already thinking of the topics that we might be covering then. That concludes my update. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cassandra?
Thank you, Jessica. Chair Fiorini and council members. Can you hear me? I just want to take a few brief moments to highlight some of the 2016 accomplishments of the Planning Division. Following through on our commitment to adaptively manage the Delta Plan and base it on best available science, council staff has completed several actions related to updating the plan. As you know, the change in approach to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan in 2015 meant it no longer met the Delta Reform Act requirements for automatic incorporation into the Delta Plan. In response, throughout 2016, the Council discussed potential Delta Plan amendment to address Delta conveyance, storage, and operations, and staff is preparing a draft amendment for the Council and the public to review early this year. In February 2016, as committed to in the 2013 Delta Plan, the Council amended the Delta Plan to include new and refined performance measures for a total of 122 administrative and 37 outcome performance measures that include metrics, baselines, and targets, and address gaps in tracking progress towards achieving the Delta Plan's goals and strategies. The Council also followed through on the commitment for transparency and accountability by launching a beta version of the Delta View, which tracks actions that contribute towards meeting the co-equal goals. In addition, we will be launching the Administrative Performance Measures Dashboard later this month, which will track progress towards meeting the 122 administrative performance measures. And you'll see that later after this presentation. In September, the Council completed the environmental review and amended the Delta Plan regulation to exempt single-year water transfers from the covered action process. This involved hearing from experts on issues related to water transfers and holding a public hearing in accordance with Office of Administrative Law requirements. In December 2016, the Council released a discussion draft of its levy investment priorities for the Delta Plan. And as you know, Dan Ray was the lead on that, so I don't know if you have additional comments on that.
Well, I think it's just worthwhile thinking about the progress we've made this year. We've talked with you, repeatedly about this, but I think through this year, the amount that we have learned about levee conditions, about the assets they protect, whether they're farms or rural villages or the urban properties or the ecosystem assets that are at stake or their influence on the water quality, the risks from flooding and earthquakes that might affect the Delta levee system. This is a really significant improvement over the information that's previously been available. We've drawn data from a huge variety of sources and engaged with local folks who've got knowledge about the system, and we've created a great tool that we can use to help support decisions. It's always going to be always be opportunities to improve. There's always new data that's coming along, and there's a lot of local detail that people are constantly reminding us of. But I think this is a tool that we can not just use now, but maintain in the future, so that as conditions change and new information becomes available and levees are improved, we can continue to have a good sense of where things are at. It's also been a great opportunity over the year to engage with Delta stakeholders. We've met dozens, I think now, of times with the in-Delta stakeholders, with their engineers, with water users, with conservation groups that are both in the Valley and the Bay Area, a wide array of state agencies. We've really strengthened our working relationship with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, both through at the staff level and with the joint meetings that you had with them in August, and then the 2x2 meetings you've set up, and that'll continue through this year. But we also have been able to reach out. We've benefited from the Delta Protection Commission's work on their funding study, looking at the feasibility of an assessment district that the council also had recommended, and they had recommended in our plans, respective plans, at the time the Delta plan was developed. And we're in conversation with the Public Utilities Commission, with Caltrans, with a wide array of other state agencies about the Delta levee system, exploring how we can work together to protect the lives, property, and state interests there. So all that's moving towards a decision, hopefully in the next couple of months. But I think a lot of progress has been made this year.
Thank you, Dan. So I just want to also highlight, besides actions involved in updating the Delta plan, planning is also involved in activities related to implementation of the plan, and some of those include support for the process of certification of consistency for covered actions. And as Jessica mentioned, we had 4 items that went through the certification process. In addition, we had 10 projects that underwent early consultation, and the council staff provided comments on more than 25 letters to ensure that projects that are not necessarily covered actions nonetheless are consistent with the Delta plans and further the co-equal goals. Staff also contributed to the activities of the Delta Protection Commission and the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, and provided an overview of the covered action certification process to the Prop 1 grant applicants. Staff worked to further support the co-equal goal of water supply reliability by working with the California Water Commission to more closely align its draft water storage initiative guidelines with our developing Delta Plan Amendment on conveyance, storage, and operations, and our continuing early consultation on Delta Plan consistency certification for the California Water Fix project. In support of the co-equal goal of protecting and enhancing the Delta ecosystem, the Council released Improving Habitat Along Delta Levees, a report that summarizes lessons learned from past levee habitat projects as a way to improve future levee investments so that they contribute to long-term improvement of river corridors with net benefits for fish and wildlife. Council staff also advised the development of a Delta Renewed, a guide to science-based ecological restoration, a new report by the San Francisco Estuary Institute intended to help shape long-term ecological planning and provide a practical foundation for future amendment of the Delta Plan. And as you know, there was Letitia Grenier came and did a presentation on that project. In addition, the staff are assisting the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and its partners to develop the draft Delta Conservation Framework, a 25-year restoration plan for the Delta, Sassoon Marsh, and Yellow Bypass. The framework is intended to serve as the continuation of the California Eco Restore Initiative beyond 2020, serve as high-level guidance for the development of more focused regional strategies, and help inform the upcoming amendment to the ecosystem elements of the Delta Plan. We anticipate there'll be an additional update on the Delta Conservation Framework process later this spring. And as you know, the legislature required that the Delta Plan to support the co-equal goals in a manner that protects and enhances the Delta as a place. And in support of that, as Jessica mentioned, the council worked actively with actively to ensure the San Joaquin County adopted a general plan that aligns with the Delta Plan and benefits all involved. The general plan adoption followed 3 years of council comment letters and meeting with the county planning department staff, county supervisors, and staff and board members of the San Joaquin County General Council of Governments. So thank you for your time. That's all I have. Please let me know if you have any questions specific to any of these actions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that kind of sums up what you'll find in the annual report, which I hope everyone will take the time to either flip through a hard copy or check it out online. It's very useful for us as we continue to share with others our role and to also figure out how to chart a course going forward, whether there are opportunities there are for us to be influential in pursuit of our mission. So it won't come as any surprise to you next month when we present the recommended work plan for 2017 that it has a lot to do with amending the Delta Plan amendments, some of which we're already engaged in and have been working on for some time, and then starting to think more specifically about an ecosystem amendment, as Cassandra mentioned. And so for now, or right now, I'd like to invite up Paul Levy of our performance tracking staff, and he's going to walk you through this tracking tool for our Delta Plan administrative performance measures and explain to you kind of what went into its development, a little bit about the database behind it, but mostly just how to use it and what you can use it for.
Well, Mr. Chairman, while he's doing that, Jessica wanted to compliment the staff on the product itself, and the maps, charts, graphics are quite illustrative of the text and helpful. So good job on this product.
Thank you, and thank you to Keith Coolidge, who's the project manager for that. Paul?
Thanks, Jessica. So I am here today to demonstrate to you the Delta Plan Administrative Performance Measures dashboard, probably about to be the most popular website on the earth.
Paul, I think, yeah, that's great. Each council member should have at your station a copy of the PowerPoint that Paul's about to share with you.
So before showing you the dashboard, I'll just give you a quick background on administrative performance measures, a quick refresher. So there are 3 types of performance measures in the Delta Plan: administrative output and outcome. Administrative measures track actions that are administrative in nature, formation of work groups, completion of plans, allocation of funds. Output measures track on-the-boots actions being taken by agencies, and outcome measures track the effects that those actions have. So just as a kind of example, an administrative measure might be completion of restoration plans. The related output measure would be the actual implementation of those plans and the construction of those projects, and the outcome would be the trends in native species using those constructed projects. So today, the dashboard I'm going to show you is only focused on the administrative measures. So as mentioned previously, there's 122 administrative performance measures in the Delta Plan. These are all based on the Delta Plan's policies and recommendations. So basically, the policies and recommendations have been turned into one or more action items, which are the administrative measures. The status of these measures was first reported to the Council in December 2014, and since then, they've been summarized in each annual report. So what this dashboard is going to do is it's going to help us track, update, and continually report on these administrative performance measures. So when someone comes to our new dashboard website, this is what they'll see: a welcome page. It has some explanatory text on the top, kind of briefly going over some of the stuff I just talked with you about. And then there's all these agency logos. So what we've done is taken the 122 measures and sorted them by the agency identified as primarily responsible for implementing those actions. Then when you hover your mouse over the agency icon, you can see a quick snapshot of progress in actions that that agency is responsible for. So this snapshot shows you the 10 most recently edited performance measures. and gives you a kind of status icon and a percent towards completion for these measures. So there are 6 different statuses that a measure can have. It can either be complete, it can be active and on schedule, active and behind schedule, inactive and behind schedule, or it can be active and ongoing, which means it's kind of a recurring action like updating the Delta plan, for example. So in addition to the status, we also have an estimated percent complete, and these are just very rough ranges. These are high-level estimates that council staff comes to in consultation with the implementing agency. So this is what you see just from hovering your mouse over the agency icon. If you actually click on the agency, you're taken to a more detailed table of the performance measures that agency is responsible for. And I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen right now, but basically this table has the chapter that the performance measure is related to, a reference number for the performance measure, the full text of the performance measure, columns for the primary agency, which is the one that you just clicked on, and any identified supporting agencies. There's also the date that it's due, the status and percent complete, and the date that the status was last updated. If you wanted to see all 122 performance measures, you can click on the View All button at the top. And if you wanted to go back to the home page, you can click on the Home button at the top. So now I'm going to go over some of the features of this list view. You can sort by clicking the column titles at the top. So if you wanted to sort them by due date, you could click on the due date column. If you wanted to sort them by chapter, you could click on the chapter column and click it again to sort it in reverse order. You can also filter by chapter using this drop-down menu. So right now we're seeing all the measures for the council. If we click down the drop-down and selected Chapter 5, we'd only see the Chapter 5 performance measures that the council is responsible for. You can also search by keywords. So for example, these are the council actions that include levies as a keyword. And at the bottom of the list view, there's also an Excel icon. And if you click that, it'll open up the records you have selected in an Excel worksheet so you can format them or add your own notes to them and print them. This website will be launching soon, and it'll be available through the Performance Measures webpage on the Delta Council website.
Nice work, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Any questions?
I think, what's notable about this dashboard is it's just useful for us as staff. It helps us to focus our engagement with implementing agencies. It helps us as we set our annual priorities, where is activity happening or where is it lagging. And it also helps us with our overall upcoming 5-year review of the Delta Plan. Some of these recommendations have been met, which is great news, and then others we may realize were just not as on target as we had hoped for them to be, or they were supplanted by other activities. And so all of that helps us to adaptively manage the Delta Plan. But then putting it online like this, we hope will be useful for others in terms of seeing how the Delta Plan is working or what are the expected activities of implementing agencies.
So in future meetings, we'll have updates on this from Paul. We'll have updates on how we're doing on the dashboard.
Absolutely.
This is really good. I imagine it gets tougher as you move to the other categories, right, of output and outcome and
just developing those categories has turned out to be very difficult.
Yeah. No, it's a terrific start. And then will there be links to the data and information that supports, well, first describes what it is that's sought to be achieved, and secondly, the data that supports how much progress is being made?
So right now, the dashboard just has the statuses and estimated percents that I showed you. There are internal, notes that we have that those are based on, But right now, in the public version, there's not necessarily a write-up for each one or a link to data sources or anything like that.
Maybe answer this, but where are we headed with that? In other words, does the dashboard link to what each of those performance measures are based on, and or will they be?
It doesn't right now, but this is just kind of the first, launch version. So I mean, as comments come in, there could be, updates and new features added to the dashboard.
Yeah. Okay.
But at this point, we were just trying to keep it pretty simple.
Do you mean, for example, Pat, where it says state grant and loan ranking criteria have been revised by December 31st? Is there a link to the revised criteria?
Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing that you mean?
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's it.
So I guess the answer is right now, not yet, but I think that is a feature that it looks like we'll consider going forward.
That link will require a telephone call to the office
Oh. Okay.
to answer the question, to get the information.
Yeah.
Well, staff have the information. It's just a matter of whether we go through and link every single activity, which I think in the future we could consider.
This is neither a criticism nor a recommendation to hugely increase your workload, but it's good as you have presented it and as you're going, and I wanted to see if we're continuing to expand that. I know it's a never-ending challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we view this as we do with Delta View, the project tracking system, as kind of a beta phase, and we'll continue to improve it as we figure out how we can best use it, but also as we get feedback from others.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're going to get to that with the Delta Levy investment strategy and the tool and updating it, because it's an ongoing necessity.
Just a comment in general, and then specifically, Paul, great job. I figured I can use this thing right off the bat. So it's you've accomplished user-friendly. So, but just, I think I'm fast running out of sort of, hey, I'm the new guy type of comment here. I told that to Member Thompson earlier. But the annual report's really helpful to me, even though I've been on the council for more than half the year. Being able to see all these things in one place and understand what we've been trying to accomplish and moving it forward, it really, everyone's to be congratulated for a successful year. I've also am just, the breadth of responsibility and the complexity of the individual tasks is really impressive. I mean, I think, really, want to make sure as somebody that's been here for more than half the year and trying to put all this together, I'm really impressed. I've always been, really kind of thrown by how many issues the council's involved in, and none of them are easy. I mean, we see a portion of them getting up to the council, but there's a tremendous amount of work being done there. And, I think the annual report really shows that, and our appreciation for the hard work and commitment of the staff and how you're moving the ball forward. So, it's not going to get easier. Maybe there's fewer things in the next year as the priorities come, but they're no less complex. And just kind of wanted to acknowledge that, and I think what we all view as a successful year, even though maybe there were a couple of setbacks. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I always try to strike the tone in my opening letter here between, all the stuff that's terribly challenging, but then also really focusing on, okay, well, where can we make progress, and where can we apply specifically our resources to aid that progress? Okay.
Anything else? I want to echo the complimentary comments of the document, the annual report, and also point out, because of Jessica's leadership, we've been able to accomplish as many things as we do. It really does a magnificent job in guiding our staff and in creating results. So it's not just the report, but the actual activities that are included in that. So thank you for that. That concludes file item number 10. Any requests for public comment? At this time, I'm going to suggest we take a 10-minute break, and we'll resume at about 5 to 12 o'clock. Find a seat. We will resume and pick up the agenda at file item number 11. File item number 11 is a discussion and updates regarding the Delta Levee's investment strategy.
Okay, well, I think we're here today to provide some responses to questions that staff received from council members at the December meeting, and also to provide you an opportunity to hear feedback that we received at the 2 public meetings that were recently held on the levy investment strategy. And just as a reminder, we have a discussion draft that's out there that's essentially in some form or another been available since August with some updates. The version that's in your packet today only has, I think, 2 small changes which were reflective of council member directed changes in December. The idea here is that as we continue to receive and digest feedback, we'll be bringing you an updated discussion draft at the February meeting. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan and Dustin.
Thank you, council members. I'll lead off, and as Jessica summarized the background very nicely, so I'm not going to go into too much of what we've done previously, but just a little bit of what we're going to be discussing today. As Jessica mentioned, we had 2 public outreach sessions this January, which were very well attended. So we'll be providing a summary of those. I will take a few of the topics. Dan and I will split that. I'll touch on a few of the specific summary topics that we heard, and Dan will take a few of those also. And then Dan's also going to address 2 other items within the staff report dealing specifically with the sea level rise and efforts that we're making in that area, along with adjusting cost allocations within the subventions program. So 3 separate topics. I'll lead off with a summary of, or begin the summary of the outreach meetings. As Jessica mentioned, the discussion draft that we went out there was very similar to the December version that you saw with some adjustments. One was Council Member Johnston's recommendation regarding the public access. That portion was truncated, and Councilmember Pifo's suggestions to add a little bit more stronger wording regarding the subventions program. So other than that, it was fairly similar to what you saw in December. With that, I want to clarify that the summary that I'm discussing here was from the public outreach sessions, and I just want to clarify that within the last week we have received 3 comment letters as well related to the levy investment strategy and the discussion draft. One from Nicole Seward, one from Bob Pike, and this morning we also received a letter from the state water contractors, all related to the discussion draft currently in its form. So this summary of information is mostly just what we've heard at the public outreach sessions. The comment letters were along similar lines, but I just want you to know that those are available separately as well. So regarding the 2 outreach sessions, the first one was held in Stockton, and it was attended by 24 separate attendees. The Walnut Grove stakeholder outreach had 38 attendees. The attendees were a combination of representatives from reclamation districts, landowners, state agencies, flood agencies, and private firms. So we had a broad representation of the folks and stakeholder interests that were there, so we were happy with that. The way the outreach meetings were set up is that we facilitated them as roundtable discussions so that we could break into small groups and have more intimate conversations regarding on specific focused topics. So we broke it up as The investments portion of it related to the levies, the maintenance and improvements was a discussion. We had a separate funding table for discussions for the folks that wanted to discuss the potential changes to the subventions programs and the deductibles. And then at the first outreach meeting, we also had a discussion group dealing with potential emergency response or multi-hazard evacuation plans and that sort. The first meeting with the emergency response measures wasn't as popular, I guess, as the other two topics. So for the Walnut Grove one, we specifically focused on the funding discussion and the levee improvements, and that still worked out just as well, I think. So regarding the information that we heard from these two outreach meetings, the highest comment that I would have to say is something that we've heard throughout the life of this project since I've been involved with it about 2.5 years ago. The message has been consistent, and it's one that we continue to hear at the public outreach meeting, and that's related in general to the subventions program. While a lot of the folks were happy that the prioritization would not apply to the maintenance portion of the subventions program as it's currently laid out in the discussion draft, the message that we continually hear is that the subventions program is a success and it should be left alone as it is. Folks do not want to see any change to that program in shape or form. They want us to acknowledge that it has been doing a good job. They say it's working fine, so leave it alone. So that comment has persisted throughout the 2 years, and we heard that again consistently at the outreach meetings. The other topic that we heard on was something we've touched on throughout the course of the project also, was the data and analysis used for the prioritization. There is still concern about the data and analysis used to develop the priorities. Some people gave examples of places where the information being used didn't square with what they saw on the ground. In other cases, some worry that the data, especially about levee conditions and fragility, is too sparse to provide reliable insights into risks into the Delta levee network. This is something that we touched on the previous year as we got into more details of the methodology analysis and the discussion of the levels of uncertainty regarding the various aspects of the analysis. That continues to be a comment that there's a lot of uncertainty dealing with the fragility curves and the analysis and the way a risk analysis is done, and there are concerns that that uncertainty is working its way into the prioritization. Another general comment topic was the priority setting itself. Many people continue to object to the idea of the state setting investment priorities based on state interests. People from islands that are highly rated were pleased, but many still prefer that rather than prioritizing some islands and tracts over others, the council should commit to bringing all islands and tracts up to the standard of law authorizing the subventions program, which is Bulletin 19282 standard. I will say as a note to one of the written comments received an acknowledgement to Mr. Pike's letter that he had a similar comment of raising all levies up to a standard, but his preferred alternative, or the one he noted, was the Delta-specific PL 8499, but in general had a similar comment of raising everything up to a standard. If decisions need to be made about what projects should proceed first, which can be deferred until later, that should be done by agreement among the Delta reclamation districts themselves and be reflected in their funding requests. Some people didn't mind the idea of setting priorities, but felt that too much priority was given to ecosystem restoration and not enough to Delta's place values like agriculture or historic communities, or simply that their island should be rated more highly because it had values that the analysis was not able to capture. One idea was that all the project levies should be a high priority to reflect the state's responsibility for the state plan of flood control facilities. And this gets to the issue of the liability that the state takes on with the state plan of flood control facilities. Another concern about the prioritization is that it doesn't account for the relationship among islands and their neighbors, and so doesn't reflect the concern that failure of one island would create risks for neighboring islands through wind-driven waves or seepage. This gets to the effect of what we've heard as the Delta being a system, and again, that all levies should be brought up to a specific standard to help maintain that system approach. Another topic we heard was dealing with the inspections recommendations within the discussion draft. There was a general agreement that a properly targeted inspection program could provide information that would improve understanding of levee conditions and maintenance and improvement needs. Some people pointed to DWR's inspection program for project levies as a good example, but there is also worry that an inspection program could be used could be just another expense or become burdensome or even punitive, or it would divert funds and attention from other levy needs. One of the folks at the meeting was tying the similarity of this with the Army Corps' PL 8499 program, where once the inspections are done, if you don't meet their criteria, you actually get kicked out of the program. So there is a concern that this would also be in some form punitive if the information is gathered, so they wouldn't want it to see used in that manner. And as far as diverting needs from other funds, what folks are saying is that if they're spending money to do the inspections, then that's money that they can't be using to do basic maintenance and improvements within their lands. There was also concern that more knowledge about the levee network could increase the potential for state liability in the event of levee failures, and this was also often referred to or referenced against the Paterno decision with the state. The last topic that I'll touch on, and this ties in with the other general staff report discussion item that Dan's going to touch on also, is sea level rise. Some water supply and conservation groups said too little emphasis was being placed on the risks that will be created as sea level rises and on the inevitability of some levee failures. They suggested the amendment should provide more direction about post-disaster recovery, including whether flooded islands should be reclaimed after a disaster or managed as wildlife and fish habitat. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan for other summary topics.
So while Dustin handled the tables that discussed the priorities for levee investment and other more engineering things, I, with Ryan's help, managed the tables that talked about funding. And so, most people who are at these meetings were coming from rural reclamation districts, so we heard often that they've got limited ability to pay for levee maintenance and improvement, so that the reliance on bond funds that are available from the state is very important. They pointed out that urban areas have got more capacity to raise funds locally, and then they also benefit from federal funds when the Corps of Engineers has been authorized to help them with their projects, where the rural islands are really dependent on the state for maintenance and improvement funds, so that those funds should be, so that the bond funds that are available should be used for subventions and special projects, rather than for urban levees or for projects with multiple system-wide benefits like improving the Yolo bypass, for example. And at the least, folks suggested that those funds need to be shared among the special projects and subventions programs and other programs, but they really emphasized the importance of having access to the bond funds that have been authorized. One of the messages that came through was that we need to make better use of the funds we have available before we're sinking new fund sources, which we have talked some about. Several people said, hey, let's make sure we're doing everything we can what we have now, because it's always easier to use money you've got than it is to try to go get some more. Suggestions about reducing paperwork and relieving regulatory burdens came up often. Suggestions, for example, to seek programmatic permits for levee maintenance activities so that we could reduce costs of obtaining permits on a project-by-project basis. And we see that's happened in Sassoon Marsh, so maybe there's some lessons we can learn over there we could bring into the Delta. We did talk a lot about beneficiary pays approaches to raising additional funds, and there's general support among the folks with whom we spoke to turning to other beneficiaries to broaden the base of funding available for Delta levies so that we can stretch the bond funds farther than by bringing in other users who benefit from the system but currently don't pay. As you could imagine, in the rural Delta, the idea of state and federal water contractors paying more to improve and maintain the levees that benefit the system was a very popular idea. We talked about other utilities, electric and gas utilities that rely on Delta levees to protect some of their infrastructure. We got some telecommunications facilities out there. We've discussed with Caltrans the limitations that they're currently under in terms of their limited ability to help improve a levee that might be protecting their property, even when it's the least cost approach to investing in, to improving the flood-proofing their facilities. And we've talked to other state agencies. People wonder, well, why don't we get Fish and Wildlife? Why don't they have to pay? Because, you know, it's their ducks that are on our islands, you know, why don't they chip in? And so I think people realize that there's other folks here who might have an interest in helping out, and we need to find a way to see how we could do that. But everybody also realizes it's a high hurdle. There's the idea of creating a Delta-wide assessment district is still under discussion within the community we talked with, in part because of the Protection Commission study has got people talking about it. And I think the impression I have, Councilmember Thompson, you may have heard similar worries that I think what we heard is that folks worry that creating a Delta-wide district would result in local landowners having to pay both into the local assessment district as well as for their own reclamation district. So rather than broadening the pot of money, it would just mean they were paying out of both pockets, and that's not a popular idea. We did talk about the idea of adjusting the deductible in the subventions program for inflation. Obviously it's not a popular idea, but the objections to that weren't as loud as I had expected. Levy maintaining agencies, pointed out that, hey, if you make us pay more for our own maintenance because you've increased the deductibles, that'll just mean we've got a little less money that might have been available for improvements on the other end of our budget. Districts that had recently raised their assessments to fund improvements worried that their constituents would feel they'd been misled if then the deductible was raised so that those dollars which they hoped would be available for improvements when they had the election now had to be used to cover the deductible. But it was, I thought, a frank conversation without a lot of rancor. We had a lot of good input, and I think Dustin and I and the other staff who were able to participate learned a lot and appreciated the interaction. And we're thinking through now over the next few days what advice we received and how to reflect that in the recommendation we bring you in February.
Patrick, you were there. I think, Dustin, Dan, you've done a great job of capturing all the comments that were made, the ones that I heard. Patrick, your observations and impressions of the two meetings?
Well, it was good of so many people to come out. They're called to a lot of meetings related to the Delta these days more than others, and so the energy that they put into it and the participation of staff, I thought was constructive. I wanted to, I don't know how best to think about this, but as a council, we'll be looking at a draft, right, Jessica, at our next meeting?
A revised discussion draft, yes.
Right, and that draft will be more than the policies and recommendations that are in tab 11 now. Is that right?
Our intention is to bring a complete redraft of the chapter, including the narrative and the policies and recommendations, but also science needs, ideas for future consideration, and performance measures.
So, council members, what we have in the stop it. What we have before us is sort of the boiled down policies and recommendations, and those are critical because that's in the end kind of what's going to matter and what people are expected to do or what we're going to apply performance measures to and so forth. But the entirety of the effort, I think, is important to see before us, including kind of a little bit of how we all got here and also where we might be going. So, for instance, one of the big issues that came up in both public meetings is, as Dustin and Dan alluded to, was that people said, there's more information that you didn't have, and so your assessment of risk is not accurate for what I'm familiar with because you didn't get this piece of information. And even if all the information was incontrovertible at a point in time, it's going to change, to be sure. So I think it's important that the narrative portion specifically and clearly say how information is going to be added and who ought to be responsible for that, so that a database on Delta Islands with respect to flood risk is an ongoing, constantly being perfected document recognizing new information and just change that occurs. So figuring that out, I think, is really crucial, and saying it, and then somebody has to be responsible for that going forward, right? So the other thing is that explaining how the finances work, or what pots of money can be accessed, or what sources of money might be accessed and which can't, for different Delta islands or different levee projects. This is like trying to understand Prop 98 school funding formula. I have to be retrained every time, there's a conversation about it. And understanding the financing of levee improvements and maintenance is complicated enough that some people understand it really well, but they're few in number. And so I think that's important. And and there's disagreements about it as well. And then the policy that flows from. So for instance, and this gets to the policy argument, should money that is already available through bond acts be utilized for flood protection solely? Should it also achieve one of the co-equal goals, which is environmental improvement, or should it not? And there's a clear view within the Delta that environmental improvements should be funded elsewhere and not using limited funds for flood protection. And yet, the council's charge is the co-equal goals, not one of them. So it seems to me we have to address that pretty clearly and deal with that. The other issue is that the interior of the Delta, where the islands are mostly agriculture, are drawing on funds that are also in demand by the bigger urbanized areas, or at least are in competition to the degree money is fungible. And so there's a concern that those islands can't compete, are going to lose out to those that are around Stockton or West Sacramento or Discovery Bay, or they're more urbanized areas. So it seems to me we have to speak to that, or at least try and acknowledge that. So in terms of the next edition of this, I think the narrative, which might spill into additional recommendations, but it ought to engage those things. And then there is the central disagreement within Delta views and what the statute, as it's been interpreted by the council, on what priorities mean. The in-Delta view, which gets voiced consistently at public meetings, is that limited funds should be used to raise the flood protection level across the Delta as a whole, and that additional protection, such as for urban areas or additional contributions to improve the environment, should be achieved from other funding sources. That is in contrast to the view that priorities mean you figure out what's the state's interests, and then look at risks and put the priorities as we have into categories of the most at risk and therefore presumed to be the highest funding priorities, and those in the next tranche and then a third tranche. So this is just a clear difference. Do you prioritize, or do you raise all levies and look for additional funding for special needs, whether they be the water delivery system or protecting residential and urban uses or achieving environmental improvements. I think that the narrative has to be clear, although it'll be in dispute, as to what the council's view of that is. And I think we say it in the Delta plan, but that logic has to be summarized here.
I want to amplify your comment about the funding sources. I had a conversation with Dan this last week in the office, and one of the things I observed is that in both of the meetings, people were using the same words but meaning different things. And I thought it would be really helpful to establish a baseline as to describe up to this point what have been the sources of funding, such as Prop 1E, Prop 84, federal funding, other funds, and just give a description, a brief description of each one of those. And then describe the funding uses, the subventions funds, the special projects, anything else that is an activity related to Delta levies. Because one of the things I found is that we're prioritizing levy improvements, and oftentimes the subvention funds are directed towards maintenance. And it's been made, I thought, pretty clear that the priorities would not prohibit DWR, the Flood Board, from directing subventions fundings to reclamation districts requesting funding for projects that are ready to go, regardless of where they fall on the priority list of the ranking that we provide. So that remained something that needs to be better clarified, that I observed at both of the meetings. And I couldn't agree with you more. There are two worldviews of how to treat levy improvements. One, incrementally addressing the highest priorities and working through that versus spreading their money around and trying to bring everything up. Either way, it's going to be years of investments and activity. So that's a decision we'll have to make as to how we want to approach this. Yes, Skip?
Mr. Chair, thank you. I want to thank staff for all the work they've done so far. Want to make a couple comments about the workshops. My staff went to the one in Walnut Grove, and what was shared with me is that Arcadis was not identified early on, and there seemed to be some confusion who Arcadis was. I think, Patrick, you would agree with me that as an former, as an elected official, you want to make sure that we're transparent, everybody understands who's playing what role. So that would be a criticism that I have of that workshop process. You know, a lot of what you said, Patrick, I agree with wholeheartedly, but I've written down some comments I'd like to go through if I may. One of the things that you, Dustin, mentioned was some correspondence you received. One of the emails was, or letters from Ms. Seward, Ireland. And what concerns me is that she pointed out several areas where the data that was being presented was just flat out wrong. And so I want to make sure we're particularly sensitive to the information that we're putting out and making sure that it is, in fact, not false information. The beneficiary pays issue. You know, the Delta Protection Commission has embarked on a feasibility study. Well, you know, as I started as a part of the subcommittee, my thought was, well, we have this pot, and the folks that are in the Delta are paying X amount of dollars. So as we bring more people into the pot, that number should remain the same or actually go down. Well, as we're starting to find out, beneficiary pays is more difficult than it appeared. I mean, there are a number of folks, you mentioned them, Dan, utilities, exporters. How do we assess these folks for the benefit they're actually receiving? And so I would caution all of us, including Delta Protection and this council, to be careful about beneficiary pays, because if you identify all the costs, then what do? Are you saying that those that are currently being assessed need to take on more? We forget we're stacking one fee on top of another, and I think Gil Cozio pointed out just the deductible increasing may hurt some of the farmers. So we need to be careful of that. Patrick, you talked about a system-wide how we prioritize things. You know, to me, I would think that we would want to come up with some sort of a standard, reach a standard for all the levies, then decide how we move forward in prioritizing the different levies. Because if we simply say, okay, the standard is fine, we won't address it, but let's look at prioritizing, I think we're defeating the purpose and maybe exacerbating the problem with some of those levies that, as I said to Randy yesterday, the levy priority really depends on which side of the levy you're standing on, I think. So we need to make sure that we don't disadvantage some of the farming community, that even a $2 or $3 per acre charge could mean the difference. Mr. Cozio mentioned some of the margins that some of the farmers have are really slim, and this $2 or $3 or $4 could mean the difference. If I can look at our draft on page 4, line 29, the council recommends that, talking about subvention.
Say again the page and
be
line
page
number.
4, line 29. It's not numbered, but.
Okay.
We've added it as a result of the discussions you all had in December.
Yes.
The council recommends that these programs should be continued with adequate funding. Their staff shared with you the importance of the subvention fund from all our workshops, the comments that have been made. And I would like to know that why we haven't said, you know, that 75-25 ratio that is currently being used ought to be considered and be a recommendation from this council. Because going to 50-50, again, it could be very problematic. And I understand that if the council doesn't make that recommendation, some of the small RDs have a hard time planning for the next go-around. What are they planning on 75-25? Is it 50-50, or is it something in between? So those are some issues that I hope we would take a more forceful issue and come up with a ratio instead of a should be continued with adequate funding. I think that is dangerous comment to make, and we ought to be looking at, as a council, coming up with a number.
Not to interrupt, but that language was specifically added in response to Supervisor Mary Pifo. But I think we continue to work on what is the right recommendation or set of recommendations from the council as it relates to subventions, cost share, and other finance considerations. So we'll be talking a lot more about that in February.
On page 9, line 6, again, is my same concern. The addition, as a result of the conversation in December, the addition was, and the council recognizing that these programs should continue to provide funding. Again, very vague. I think we ought to be more specific. I asked Jessica what that ratio is on these special projects. She said staff might have that ratio.
Yeah, the special projects program doesn't have a set ratio, so they can, I believe, provide up to 100% of costs. They have usually expect a local cost share, and I think we're aware of projects that have been.
Special projects do get up close to 90%, yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd say there's been some substantial state investments in those, yeah.
Okay. Again, just it's not as clear to me reading this report as I would hope it would be. The Delta Levees investment strategy workshops. What are we expecting to come out of that? When's it going to be finalized?
Well, we're anticipating that we'll begin sitting down as a staff tomorrow, and over the next couple of weeks, I suspect we'll hear some more. We gave people comment sheets to send in if they wanted to, with the requests that we get up next week. You see a few letters that are drifting in. We're continuing our conversations with other state agencies. But I think we'll be trying to draft a recommendation that we hope we'll be able to bring back to you for your February meeting, with the idea that then you could take another round of public testimony then, and then give us direction about changes that you want to see that we could bring back to you for action in the subsequent months.
Okay. And my last comment or thought is there was this issue of flood insurance brought up. I don't know, it may have been brought up at the DPC, but it's in response to the FEMA rates. And so where is that in this discussion about an insurance program for the state of California as opposed to FEMA?
Well, there has been recent attention to that issue. Some people may have seen the commentary that came out of UC Davis's water blog, suggesting that should be explored, and that is a recommendation of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the draft plan too, that the state should explore a state-based flood insurance program. I mean, the observation has been that the California ratepayers in the insurance program have put a lot more money in than they've gotten back. Mm-hmm. I think and so the thought was, well, we'd be better off if we had our own program. We could keep that money at home and maybe lower rates. Given the other side of that discussion would be, well, given the extreme variability of California's hydrology, that we're ahead now might just mean our day hasn't come. And so I think that's a useful conversation to have. And if the council wants to weigh in on it, I think that would be appropriate if that's your choice.
That was going to be my question. Does the council feel there's an opportunity to weigh in and try to accentuate or affect some sort of change in flood insurance through a different program?
Yeah. The flood insurance bill is, I believe, due for reauthorization in this session of Congress. And it'll get a lot of attention, driven by budget concerns and the huge deficits in the flood insurance program at the federal level because of the disasters in New Orleans and the Carolinas and New York and New Jersey. About 4 years ago, the Congress said, hey, we want this to be on more of an actuarial basis. We're losing billions of dollars here. So they raised rates. And then there's such sticker shock to people who were buying insurance, and it's such an impact on home values of flood-prone property as well, because you've got to pay more for insurance, you get pay less for a mortgage, so your house values go down across the board. Then they put some caps on the changes in the rates. In California, a big focus here in the Valley has been on how those changes in insurance rates have affected farmers in rural areas, because the restrictions that come with the insurance program make kind of the way we do farm infrastructure in the Valley very difficult. You got to flood-proof your grain dryers and your farm labor housing and all that. People think that's probably not realistic given how our region has been established. So I think the council, what we've emphasized in the staff recommendation, and I think it's the very last part of the discussion draft. Yeah, it's on page 21. in line 21 of the discussion draft, we've emphasized urging Delta communities to improve what's called their community rating under the community rating system of the National Flood Insurance Program, because you can lower your flood insurance rates in your community by taking proactive steps to reduce risk, by better evacuation planning, by having programs that buy out frequently flooded structures, by adding flood proofing to community facilities so that you're moving like the electrical systems up to the top of the buildings instead of having them in the basement. And we see here in the valley, in the Delta, and nearby we've got some communities, I think Roseville, in suburban Sacramento, they're the #1 rated community in America, and they've cut their flood insurance rates dramatically. Whereas other communities, that we see in the Delta have made only a few steps. And that's because people have got, obviously a lot of demands on their time, and they only make so much progress. But we think that that's an area where, Delta communities could do a real service to their constituents, both helping them be safer, reducing flood damages, and also reducing their flood insurance rates. And we thought that was practical. So flood insurance is an important part of the equation. And if the council wants to explore it more, we could find ways to address that.
And just very quickly, Mr. Chair, Patrick mentioned, the urban levees are protecting urban areas that have resources. I think who I'm talking about are those less rich communities that can't do what you're talking about. So how do they reduce their risk index number, whatever you want to call it, without spending a lot of money that they may not have?
Yep.
And so I'm just suggesting that this could be another avenue to assist those in the Delta that help themselves.
Yeah. One of these we've done, and it's on up in the funding section. We have a recommendation that as the state considers new bonds or other fund sources, one of the things they should do is set aside some money for those sorts of non-structural things. Because right now, if you want to come to the state for assistance with a flood hazard, usually your choice is, do you want to build a levee or not? And we need to give people the full range of choices to address the risks that they're exposed to.
Ken?
The most dense part of this for me has been understanding where, what funding sources funds what. And I think Senator Johnson kind of, articulated better how complex this is and also, these stark choices. I think in previous meetings, staff sort of indicated, because, being unfamiliar with this, that the bulk of the funds were coming from bond issues, bond measures.
Overwhelmingly, yeah.
Yeah, overwhelming. Thank you, Dan. By definition, those bond measures are statewide, and there's some, there's rules to that. So, one question I have is, how much flexibility is there in interpreting the intent of a bond measure to limit funding to, how strict can you make criteria, or are these all discretionary actions? Do you start winding up bumping against the intent or the language of the bond measure? And by definition, bond measures are finite. Bond money runs out. Nobody knows you're going to get another bond measure.
Yeah.
You can hope, but, that sort of argues to prioritizing, what you have in hand. But I wonder if there are constraints on, what we can do and just.
Well, there certainly are constraints. We can't divert money for purposes for which they're beyond what's authorized in the bond. Another example of a constraint in a bond act is in the funds in Prop 1, not yet appropriated, which are authorized by the bond for improvements to delta levees that serve multiple objectives and enhance the environment. And then it lists 4 different purposes for specific projects or programs or types of uses for which those funds might be used. Subventions, special projects, which are the 2 things we talk about a lot. And it has a very open-ended criteria, which I don't have in front of me. We shared it in the last staff report, but I think is reduce risks of flooding and from levee failure or earthquake or something like that. That's very broad. And then the third is emergency response, which I think that's about the language which I took to mean if there's a disaster and these funds are around, you can use them to help recover from the disaster. So those are examples of sort of each bond has got its own targets. Within those, the law generally assigns either to the Department of Water Resources or to the Flood Board the authority to adopt guidelines about how those funds would be distributed. And there's often quite detailed prescriptions about how that would work. The deductible is an example of that, or the requirement in the subventions program that they analyze the ability of districts to pay is an example of that. And then the other question is then how would our regulation or recommendation work together with that additional guidance? In many cases, we're providing direction not just in levees, but in ecosystem restoration or even about conveyance, storage, and operations about how bond funds should be used. I mean, even the fundamentals of the State Water Project, way back somewhere under that, there's the bonds that were passed way back in the 60s to get that moving. And so we need to be careful in each case that we're using our authority appropriately.
So, as policymakers here, when we evaluate alternative ways to approach this, we've got to keep in mind that this one set of priorities has to be able to be applied to multiple bond measures, which may have different requirements, or is that what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
Is that, it's broad enough, but not too broad that you're inconsistent with the bond measures?
Yeah, and I think the way I imagine would expect this to work out is the department for special projects or for urban flood control projects, or if it's considering improvements to this system-wide plan of flood control for the Central Valley, or the flood board if it's approving guidance that the department is prepared for the subventions program, would be tailoring that guidance to the fund source and the needs that they see. It's just that the priorities that we're proposing would then integrate with that. I mean, the department and the special projects program, for example, they have already done targeted solicitations that aim at this particular use or that particular objective. Projects that would include substantial ecosystem restoration features. Or right now there's a solicitation going on through the State Plan of Flood Control System for small communities. And so they'll continue to do that, tailoring the guidance, I would think, to the fund source they've got available.
So in a statewide bond measure, where there's a statewide interest in that. So I would imagine what we're doing here for future writers of bond measures for flood control or levee protection. I mean, that we're sort of setting some guideposts for the future also, because these bond monies available now are going to run out. So
and that may be the thing that we've talked about a report to the legislature accompanying the Delta Plan Amendment or following it, and that may be one of the things that we want to talk about more in February and think about going ahead is, well, what does that report look like? There certainly is a large gap, for example, between the funds that are needed to bring all the Delta levies up to the desire we hear expressed to bring them up to that Bulletin 192 level. And so maybe you want to make a suggestion that, well, there should be an additional bond that would devote funds to A, B, or C. That may be one of the things you want to provide direction about.
So I just had one more question, Mr. Chair. It's that issue, and maybe I'm confused over what I'm hearing, the input, is that there seems to be resistance to some standard. You mean whether it's the Army Corps standard?
I think within the Delta, and I think we're comfortable too, that the legislature has said that the standards that are included in Bulletin 192 should guide investment in delta levees. And that includes a standard for urban areas and a standard for rural areas. And then, of course, for the real urban areas, the metropolitan areas with more than 10,000 people, the Central Valley Flood Protection Act also has a standard. And I don't think any of those are in dispute. I think the question is, if we don't have enough money to get everybody up to that level now, how do we approach that? You know, do we get everybody halfway there, or do we get a few areas all the way there and then go try to find the money to get the next areas there?
Okay, good, because I thought maybe there was some dispute that there was a standard.
I don't think so. I think we're all, tell me if I'm wrong, I think we're all comfortable with that Bulletin 192-82 standard as a base level of protection. It's just a question of how can we get there?
Yeah, for the most part, the local reclamation districts, their engineers, everybody seems to be in favor of that. Originally, when we started this, there was a lot of discussion of the Delta-specific PL 8499 program, but the kind of contention I think that you heard with that was the strict nature of that program and how easy it is for folks to fail and actually get kicked out of it. And the PL 8499 discussion was really geared more towards tying into additional funding also, and those reassurances that if you were in that program, that would be a potential additional source of money. But as far as the levy standards, I don't think we've heard any problems with folks reaching the Bulletin 192-82 or not wanting to get there.
Okay, so I would imagine that there's an inspection to validate whether you've met that standard at some point in time?
Well, I think that's why we have the inspection recommendation. One of the things that we're seeing is that, and you'll see this when we come back to you in next month, is our understanding of the information available to understand based on the objective data. Here's the condition of the levees in terms of their progress towards that standard is mixed. Every time we use that data, which comes to us from the Department of Water Resources, we have Delta reclamation districts who say, well, that's not the case. The situation is more like this. And so to me, that's one of the reasons that it's sharing inspection reports so we all know what the condition of the levees is. That's an important objective if we can get there.
Yes, makes sense, especially in return for funding. So thank you. It helps clear things up for me.
I wanted to just cover briefly two additional issues that we had touched on last month. And one was something that Judge Dan Morrell brought up, asking questions about how sea level rise might affect the Delta. And of course, we've had testimony at our workshops from both representatives of the state and federal water contractors, as well as from a conservation organization. And they've both suggested, hey, that maybe that we're not taking the risk of sea level rise as seriously as we ought to. Now, the Delta plan is based on a scenario in which sea level at Golden Gate rises by 55 inches by 2100. And that guidance was included in the Reform Act as something that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan would have to address. And it was the best guidance that was available at the time our plan was adopted back in 2013 and 2012 as it was being developed. A more recent science, though, does suggest that because the ice melt in the Arctic and Antarctic is occurring more rapidly than had been anticipated, it suggests that sea levels may rise even higher. And so based on that concern, the Natural Resources Agency is now suggesting that we should be evaluating sea level rises based on the higher end of scenarios for sea level rise that came out of the National Research Council's report from a few years ago. So Arcadis has done those a scenario, the forecast that shows what that would mean in the Delta, and I had previously reported to you, it's about 6 to 8 inches at Walnut Grove. And so in the course of these conversations over the last month, several people said, well, yeah, Walnut Grove, but what's it going to be out on the west end of Sherman Island, where you're facing out towards Sassoon Bay at the confluence of the San Joaquin and the Sacramento. So we asked Arcadis to give us more of the information that they prepared so we would understand better the full range of conditions. And as it turns out, just to, make sure we're sharing with you the information we have, at the western end of Sherman Island, those sea level rises would be about 2 feet. And on the San Joaquin River, at the sort of where the confluence with Middle and Old Rivers, it might be about 20 inches. So that's a little more worrisome than 8 inches. And so we asked Arcadis to then recalculate the risk of sea level rise, how that would affect sea level rise at that level would affect the risk of levee failure. And so, Bob, if I could get that slide up. And so this is a map that depicts the potential effects of rising seas on delta levees. And the map at the left is the risk of sea level rise under current conditions. And on the right, it would be the risk of levee failure in 2050 with levees in their current conditions. So the map on the right doesn't reflect any improvements that might be made in levees. The darker the blue, the more the risk of levee failure. And the areas that are dark blue, the risk of failure is between 4 and 10%. The areas that are orange have got risks of failure above 10%. So that's a pretty worrisome level. You think I'm going to be in a 10-year floodplain? And you can see that under current conditions, there's about a half dozen islands that have got a risk of levee failure of 4 to 10%. Now, I take that too. I think it's important to keep what that risk of failure, keep in mind what that indicates. I think it's better to think of this as just check the relative change rather than focus on the 4% or 5%. Because, for example, we know that an important proportion of levee failures in the Delta are sunny day failures that aren't caused by flooding or earthquakes, and so that's not reflected here as an example. But I think if you look towards 2050, you see that instead of having that what happens across the Delta is the risk of levee failure about doubles. So many islands, that doesn't seem like such a big deal because maybe it's less than 2% now, and so it's going to be 4%. Well, that's a little more worrisome, but it may not be something I got to panic on. But there's, instead of having a half dozen islands that are in that category of having a levee failure risk of 4 to 10%, in the 2050 scenario, it's 24 islands. So we can see that over time, the risks of failure are going to grow, that improvements we make soon to get to the, for example, the Bulletin 192.82 level gives us 1.5 feet of freeboard above the base flood elevation. If we're going to raise the sea level by 1.5 feet, 2 feet, well, we have to repeat those just to stay even with the flood risks that the rising seas would provide. Now, we've asked Arcadis then to calculate for us what they think those costs might be, what it would cost to stay abreast with the rising seas. So we haven't presented that previously. And so when we come back to you February, one of the things that will be different from the numbers we've presented in the past will be that we'll have a little column that shows sea level rise accommodation, so we can begin to really understand what the costs are. And I have a simple view on this, which is, just as a consumer, I never want to take out a car loan that's going to last longer than the car. I don't want to be paying on my Ford when it's in the junk pile, So I sort of think about levies in the same way, and so we're paying for levies with bonds that have 30 or 40-year maturities. And so the investments we want to make now, we want to have some assurance that they're going to be useful, in 2050. Now, we've got time to respond to these changes, So I think when we bring you back priorities, it's still going to reflect current conditions. I think we want to address the risk today, but as Councilmember Johnston pointed out, we have to keep the tool up to date, and as we update the Delta Plan, over the years, we've got to then reflect the risks as they change and be prepared to pivot with accommodation strategies that reflect the growing risk that we're going to face, and it's not a happy picture. It's worrisome. Thanks, Bob. Then we also had talked last month about updating the Delta Levy Subventions Program deductible. What were the practical implications of that, and what would that mean? I think we had reported that the subventions deductible of $1,000 per levy mile was established in 1981, hadn't been updated for inflation. If you adjusted it based on the Consumer Price Index, I think we reported previously it's about $2,600 a mile would be then. What deductible would be. People said, well, that's not reasonable. Let's look at other indexes. So we looked this month. I can tell you that if we used a Bureau of Reclamation index for earthen dams, which is sort of a similar construction approach to the Delta levies, you applied that index to the $1,000 per levy mile, it would give you a deductible of about $2,435. We also looked at a basket of farm commodities that are the 5 most commonly grown crops in the Delta using USDA index numbers, and that would give you a deductible of about $2,250. Now, for a typical reclamation district, their assessments, we reported this a couple of years ago, they average kind of $10 to $40 annually per acre. It varies from district to district, and higher assessments than that range are usually found, or often found, in the levy districts that receive significant state funds. So, and then the effects of the deductible also vary among districts, because smaller islands that might have lengthy levies can have, then their deductible amount goes higher. So for a typical Delta Reclamation District, right now the $1,000 per mile deductible turns out to represent about $2.50 to $4.50 annually per acre. If it was raised to $2,500 per mile, that amount would then be instead about $6.50 to $11 annually per acre. So it's something you would notice, I think, if it was coming out of your pocket. But some districts would be hit harder than that, because you've got especially small districts, some of which have irregular levy systems, so that their levy system isn't efficient. They may have more miles of levy per acre protected than some others. And so, for example, in Fay Island, which is an 89-acre total size of the district, over on the Contra Costa shoreline, the $2,500 per mile deductible would represent an increase in the deductible to almost $4,500 an acre. $45 an acre, I'm sorry. And then the other question is, well, what difference does it make if we make those adjustments? Is it worth the trouble? Are we making a big difference? So if you look Delta-wide, the deductible over the last 4 years for what we have information for ranges from $750,000 to $770,900. So it's not a huge amount of money, but it would be part of a substantial, important levy improvement. If you increased it to $2,500, the budgeted deductible would increase to $1.9 million. So the net effect would be that local property owners would be putting in about $1.2 million more to cover the base cost of maintenance, and then that would either extend the existing bond funds maybe for a little bit longer, or possibly fund 1 or 2 major levee rehabilitations. So it's noticeable, but it's not a deal breaker one way or the other. We are still looking also at methodologies for assessing local districts' ability to pay, and we're expecting a report from Arcadis in the next week or so, and we'll have that advice for you as part of our February recommendation. So that would conclude my report, unless there's questions.
If there are no other questions, I've got a couple of requests for public comment. Let's go to Patrick Porgau.
My name is Patrick Borgans.
Borgans.
I'm not speaking loud enough. If you can't hear me, let me know. Is it running? Yes. Excuse me. There we go. My name is Patrick Borgans. I'm wearing this hat because I'm light sensitive, not because I'm trying to be different. I have 45 years in the Delta. I have 79 fact-finding volumes on water in the West. I first of all want to compliment each one of you for the work you're doing. It's a massive undertaking. And you don't have the collective memory. We lose a lot of people along the way. I want to go back to the beginning, though, and I want to focus on something the chairman was saying. First of all, we have to go back and understand how we got to be where we are. And then we have to figure out what happened along the way. And then we have to ask ourselves, was there protections provided for the Delta in the past? In 1960, under the California Water Resources Development Bond Act, there was master levies incorporated into Section 12943. Excuse me, I'm sorry about this. 12934D of the Water Code. Master levies are in there. They took the $89 million that they were going to use for the master levies and rerouted the money and determined in 1967 they weren't going to put the money in there. In 1982, I went to work for people up on up there at Walnut Grove and a number of their districts. I had just completed some reports, 10-year report on the state water project, showing that the water project wasn't paying for itself. So they took money from other places, which you were one of them, the Delta. So in 1982, I completed a report for the Delta farmers, and I showed that we got them $120 million under that subvention funds, under the SB 34. That was our work. We got that money. We got $500 million back from the project. That went back to the general fund. Now, there is no Delta conveyance system. They're talking about a new one under the California water fix. The Delta channels and the levees are what's moving that water through there. And what I'm saying is that we need to start looking at another way to generate money without going to the bonds. We've got $20 billion in bonds just since 2000. A lot of this money is going for things that help supplement the state water project's water needs. This is what's happening. The problem in the Delta, you had, in 1927, you had water right protections under the initial filings for the Department of Finance. That went over to the Bureau. You were then guaranteed that there were going to be salinity protections in the southern end of the Delta. Didn't happen. They also told us that they were going to do other things in the process of providing their plan. What I'm saying to you is, you want to find more money? I can show you where there's a lot of money. I can show you how they rerouted money back out of the fourth priority under the State Water Project, and that's billions of dollars that are going back to the State Water Project contractors. Now, you guys, if you're interested in saving the Delta, and I'm a very headstrong person about the Delta, I don't own any land there, I own no water there, and I'm here today as a pro bono. I'm letting you know that if you want more money, I know where it's at. If you want leverage on how to get them to give you the money, I can show you how to do that too. I worked for Sherman Island, and we got them their money, and I'm telling you now, here's the important thing. When you take these islands out of production or you minimize the amount of agriculture on them, it's a 49-to-1 ratio to get water down into that Sherman Island, which has been purchased by the Department of Water Resources. So if you look at the amount of carriage water you're talking about there, you're talking hundreds of thousands of acre feet. So what does all that mean to you guys? The water's moving through the Delta. Nobody's got a conveyance system. If they're pushing it through the aqueduct, they got to pay to maintain the aqueduct. I'm saying to you, and this is how we got the money back in '82, they never provided the protections. You don't have them now, and you guys are trying to do a hell of a job, and I pray to God you win, that you work it out. But what I'm saying, I'm almost finished. Did you have a question, sir?
I was going to thank you, but...
That's okay. What I'm saying to you, there's a way to do this. And if the contractors are getting tens of millions of dollars back from the California Water Fund money, which is what they did, under the fourth priority, they were supposed to use that for future construction. They took that money to offset their cost. So the cost that you're incurring here should be placed partly on them for conveying water through the system. So if they're moving 5 million acre feet on average through there, surcharge them. We need to surcharge every acre foot of water that goes through that delta that's moving through those private levees, that 75% private levees. And in conclusion, this is all hearsay. They pay money. If I'm hired by somebody these days in California on water, they pay them to get rid of me. Anyway, I hope that was helpful to you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Next up, Tom Zuckerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. I find it both challenging and accurate. First of all, I want to thank you for the amendment you're making in your recommendation to support the levy programs. I'm a little bit surprised that there's a subsequent discussion about the 75-25 funding mechanism for the subventions program. I didn't pick that up out of the discussion that you had at your last meeting. I thought you were expressing your support of the historical program. And I don't know, it doesn't sound like it's quite coming across that way, because as you go on in your report, you start questioning whether the 75% state share is correct or not. I want you to know that there's a lot of history in this, and it's been in effect for some period of time. The legislature did special studies to try to determine what the fair ratios would be, and they were looking at boaters, they were looking at utilities, they were looking at railroads, they were looking at everything in the thing, and it was very complicated. And they arrived at that proportion of money between the locals and the state as a way of spreading the benefits and the costs fairly across the landscape at that time. And this was not for building levees to grow cities or to transport water or anything. This was for that base level of protection that I talk to you about all the time. The PL 18292 program is not to build urban levees. It's not to build levees for transport of water. It's a base level of protection. It's an agricultural standard, basically, that the Department of Water Resources has resisted using any of that money to build urban type levees, because they don't want to encourage, we don't want to encourage inappropriate residential development out in areas that are being supported by this program. So please understand that. There's wisdom in this allocation of funds. I would merely cite to you the fact that in this last week or so, we've once again encouraged some extremely high water conditions in the Delta, and any of the flooding that you might have anticipated in the Delta itself really hasn't occurred. We've had some riverine flooding along the McCollum based upon the releases that are being made from upstream in Comanche Dam and Pardee, but you haven't seen any of the significant levee failures down in the central portion of the Delta that you might have anticipated if you were only reading the Dreams report or that sort of thing. So what we're doing is very effective. We want to continue that. We want to see this money that's been set aside in bond issues and by the legislature for Delta levee protection spent on levee protection. There's adequate funds that have been designated in those same bond issues for other purposes, environmental purposes or otherwise. We don't have to rely just upon the Delta levy funds to solve everybody's problem. There should be, when we're talking about environmental improvements or protection in those things, we should be able to access the funding that was set aside for those types of things, and not say that the money that was designated for Delta levies has to solve everybody's problem on this stuff. It's precious little. We don't need too much more to get up to this basic level of protection, and we want to get there. Now, I want to say that I thought, Senator Johnson, you did a wonderful job of summarizing the issue, and I mean that. I think he really has applied himself to this subject, and you need to listen to his exposition of what these issues are. And I want to thank both of you for attending the 2 Delta levy workshops. I was there for a while at Walnut Grove. Unfortunately, the acoustics are such in that place that I couldn't hear anything that was being said, so I just decided rather than get more frustrated, I would just leave. But I think you got the gist of the public input in that thing. There is a lot of concern in the Delta that some of these funds that have been designated in the bond issues are going to get diverted into other purposes or for other reasons and so forth, and I trust you'll make sure that that doesn't happen. I also just wanted to comment briefly on the letter that you received. It's a very lengthy letter from Bob Pike, which I just had an opportunity to sort of scan. But I think what Bob is trying to say is that really trying to determine what levy is going to fail at what point in the Delta is really not science. It's kind of a fool's errand to try to predict with some precision as to where this is going to happen. And he is a very, very well thought of and experienced guy that's worked on geotechnical issues all over the world, and particularly in the Delta. And what he is saying is this Delta levy system operates as a system, and you need to it's like the old expression, like a rising tide, lifts all ships. You need to have a base level of protection out there. His base may be a little bit higher with the fat levies than the standard that we're dealing with, but that's where we have to get. And if we have sea level rise, we're going to see that coming. It doesn't happen in 1 year. And now you have a base that you can operate from. It's not like being at the San Francisco airport where what are you going to do? The water rises above the level of the runways. They don't have any levees there. Or Foster City, where people have built houses up on the levees. And we have levee systems there that are basically unencumbered. If we develop the base system, we can improve that over time as the need arises. And I don't think we need to worry about whether this is the last opportunity we're going to have to do it. It's going to be an ongoing problem. So the money that we have set aside, let's spend it wisely. Let's spend it for this base level of protection, and then try to figure out how the other beneficiaries who need higher levies can participate in the funding of that, which is what we've been preaching here all along. I think that is the gist of what I wanted to say. I still am going to welcome you, Supervisor Thompson, you and Mr. Fiorini, the chairman here, to get together and write a clear letter to the governor telling him that the Delta Protection Commission and the Stewardship Council support the extension of the Delta Levy Subventions Program and not allow that to be a basis for further vetoes of the legislation we fought so hard to get through the legislature this last year. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to address them.
Well, Tom, in terms of the base level, bringing the levies up to a base level of protection, essentially you're focusing on agricultural islands.
That's what the program was for, yeah.
Right. And then do you have an estimate of what we've heard some estimates of what that would require. Do you have a number in mind that would be necessary to bring those islands up to the minimum level?
Yeah, well, it's not my number, it's Gil Cozio's number, and you've heard it here before. We started off at something like $1 billion, but there's been enough money spent out of the program over the last several years to bring that number down quite a ways. And I don't know if it's 600 million or 400 million, or it's somewhere in that general category. And the reason we're so nervous about the diversion of these funds is that, as your staff has indicated, there's $155 million left in the prior bond issues. There's $295 million that's designated in the Prop 1 thing, and that, if we can spend those funds or the bulk of them on this thing, we're almost home on getting the Delta up to this base level of protection. And it really should be the #1 priority at this point, from not only for the current situation, but to provide the base that we can operate from to protect ourselves for the future and for these higher need, lower risk types of things that you're looking at.
So just to clarify, that estimate then doesn't include the urban areas?
No, it's basically the areas that the two levy programs have worked in. Those two programs, which are both designated in Prop 1 as the #1 and #2 things there, are basically to get to the Bulletin 8292 level. And the urban levies have been a different situation, where you have Corps of Engineers programs, urban populations, and one thing or another, other means of funding and addressing those issues. And that's not what the special projects and the Delta Subvention Program monies were being spent for. If you take that money and start spending it on urban levies or environmental projects, or to improve water delivery to the Valley or Southern California, we're left high and dry. I'd like to be high and dry. Maybe that's the wrong expression.
Okay,
Low
thank you.
and wet.
It's, Tom, I want to thank you for refocusing us back on the issue of the Delta levies and subvention fund, because, in reading the report, it's great to say we support something, but speaker after speaker, I've heard that 75-25 has worked. Why not continue it? Allows the reclamation districts, knowing how, something I said, allows RDs to, with some certainty, to move forward with planning. And so I think it's an important number, and it ought to be seriously considered at this council. So I thank you.
Good. Thank you. I would say that you're stepping into big shoes here. Don Natoli and Larry Rustaller, Mary Pepo, yourself. I mean, welcome, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Any others? Okay, I think that any final comments from the council, direction to staff? I think Dustin, Dan, you have some direction that we'll receive back in February. That concludes file item number 11. File item number 12, public comment on any matter. None. File item 13, meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming.